All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to see everyone here, and thank you to everyone who's traveled long distances, and thank you to those of you who are local as well, especially those who are hosting. As we get started today, let me just note that there's a QR code up here if you haven't already seen it. If you want to pull up the copy of the agenda online, you can do that by taking a shot of that QR code. I'll give you a second to do that. I realize I should have kept that on the slide for the first several slides so that I could advance. All right. Okay, let me go ahead and get started. I first want to really gratefully acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work and to learn here from each other today. My name is Toni Schmader. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia, and I'm the director of Engendering Success in STEM, the research consortium that brings us together here today in partnership with the Institute for Gender and the Economy. And so I do want to thank all of the partners to today's event, including Gender and the Economy and Rotman, as well as some funding that we have from Engineers Canada, the University of Toronto's Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering, SFU, Simon Fraser University, and SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, that's funded our consortium for the past 7 years. Engendering Success in STEM, I just want to give you a quick introduction to who we are for those of you who have maybe heard of us but haven't been part of the consortium or come to a meeting in the past. We're a research partnership that was formed in 2017, again, with funding from SSHRC, from a partnership grant. We bring together kind of three constituencies. So a group of social scientists who have theoretical and research expertise in the nature of implicit bias, intergroup contact, and stereotype change and inclusion, along with STEM experts who have research or expertise in outreach to groups to try to advance the interest of inclusion for girls, women, and other underrepresented groups in STEM contexts, and then with the really fantastic engagement and support of a wide range of educational and professional partners. I just want to introduce you to some of the people and the way our project has been formulated. We've been taking an evidence-based approach to gender inclusion with 4 different research projects. You're going to hear about these later on in the afternoon. So Project Climb aims to examine how best to change the implicit biases that we know kids develop early in childhood. Project Prism examines how to motivate young girls to choose a STEM career. Project Sync looks at how to help young women then cope with the stress that can come from feeling a lack of fit and belonging when they come into their first job or co-op position, for example. And Project Rise tries to understand how we can create a more inclusive workplace culture for diverse peoples. Just to introduce you to some of the project leads who are the founding fellows of Engendering Success in STEM. Andy Barron and Jen Steele are the kind of co-leads on Project Climb. Steve Spencer and Steve Wright, co-leads on Project Prism. Liz Page Gould and Sonia Kang, co-leads on Project Sync, and myself and Hillary Bergseeker, co-leads on Project Rise. Again, we have this fantastic engaged group of STEM experts who've worked with us these many years, including Mary Wells, the Dean of Engineering at University of Waterloo, Cheryl Staub-French, who's here from the University of British Columbia, as well as some others. And I actually want to give a special shout out to Elizabeth Croft, even though she's not here, just because it was a collaboration that started with her over about a decade ago or more that really started me on this path of working so closely with many of you who specifically work on inclusion for women in engineering. And we've also had just the great thrill of training some of the next generation of scholars. And so Antonia Gonzalez, Rotem Callahan, Joyce He, Kate Block, Katie Kroper, and Will Hall. Some of them are here with us today and will even have a chance to speak. But these are people who started out as our students and are now fellows as part of the consortium. Again, we've had the funding, the generous funding and support of over 36 different ESS partners who've been actively engaged with us over these several years, and an advisory board of people from different areas of expertise who've also offered guidance and support along the way. Some of the highlights to date you'll hear about throughout today's session, because some of the speakers today are members of the consortium, but we've published over the last 6 years nearly 200, or nearly 100 publications, nearly 200 presentations, lots of media outreach and workshops, and the training that we've done for graduate students and postdocs who've been part of the consortium along the way. And you've probably seen on your table this booklet that was designed by Tim Kagiri, our new knowledge mobilization specialist, that pulls together some of the infographic white papers that our team has produced. The QR code here also takes you to our Success in STEM website, where you can also download or view these infographics individually on our resources page. The booklets are available in the back by the water table, so feel free to pick one up, as well as another sort of small journal for notes that comes from GATE. The agenda here today, again, I'll put the QR code up again for those of you who still need to grab the QR code for the agenda. So we have an exciting lineup of speakers. They'll be introduced individually before each of the talks. We'll have a break throughout the day, and lunch at 12:30. We'll hopefully have a chance to network and have a chance to chat with you all. A couple things just to say. The restrooms are available when you are facing the registration desk. They're to the left. So they're to the left of the registration desk if you need to find them. I believe there's rooms where if you need a private space for a period of time to take a call or do a bit of work, that can also be available. You can grab one of our team to find out more information about that. And we are going to be using Slido for questions in the panels. And so you'll want to go to slido.com, and there's information on your tables too where you can find this. Just a quick note that when you're using Slido, you can ask questions or put in questions throughout the panel. If it's a question targeted to a specific person, list their name in the question, and then the moderator will help facilitate that discussion. But we'll be using Slido exclusively for questions. And you can also follow us on various social media outlets. Tim's going to be doing some social media shout outs throughout the day as well. So with that, I'm happy to hand things over to our first keynote speaker, Dr. Sarah Kaplan, who's the Distinguished Professor and Founding Director of the Institute for Gender and the Economy here at University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. And Sarah's here to speak with us today about gender in the economy and its possibilities. So join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank you. And apparently it's something L. Control L? Control L. There we go. Oh, but it's not. It will get there. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. This has been such a wonderful partnership with the Engendering Success in STEM. It's been such a thrill for the Institute for Gender and the Economy to be involved. And on the, oh, there it's appearing. On the agenda, not up there, but on the agenda, it says I'm the director of the Institute for Gender and the Economy, but now I've taken on the title of founding director because Dr. Sonia Kang is now our academic director, and I am riding a horse. off into the sunset. Very excited for Sonia to take over at GATE, and very excited for me to be able to do things like this and do special projects. Now we're 7 years in the making, about the same age as this partnership as well. So really thrilled for this event, this culmination of this partnership. And what I want to talk about is, in a way, not the things that are on the rest of the agenda, but I'm going to show you how it's all linked together. Because what I'm going to talk about is inclusive product, service, and policy design, and how that is related to these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion inside organizations. So I'm going to kind of flip the script, and at the end I'll come back and try to tie things in. But one of the things that we've been thinking about at GATE is, I was just talking to Marilyn Spink before this. She's like, I'm still so mad. Why is it 2023 and we still haven't made as much progress as we should have? I was mad in 2016. That was, I founded the Institute for Gender and the Economy because I was mad. And so we continue to think about different ways to get inclusion embedded into our economy and to create a more inclusive economy. And so one angle that we're taking is around this products and services. So I've been cursed with technology lately, so. Try now. Okay, there we go. Don't need to convince you. This is why I'm mad. And then, war, climate change, all these kinds of things are actually pulling us backwards. Some of the political stuff that's happening is pulling us backwards, so we're not where we need to be. The challenge is more urgent than ever. You probably are all familiar with this kind of research that shows the ways in which the ways in which gender, and we could talk about other forms of inequality, get embedded in decisions that get made about all sorts of things, like how hireable someone is when you have the same resume in an audit study, and Jennifer is seen as less less attractive as someone to hire than John is. The study of innovation pitches to venture capital investors, and you have the exact same pitch, the exact same economics, the exact same product idea, but one is narrated by a woman's voice and one is narrated by a man's voice. And then you ask the investors, would you invest in this? And of course, the one narrated by a woman's voice is seen as half as investable as the exact same business narrated by a man's voice. Or if you think that there's some bias around, we just code because we're humans, the study that I found particularly compelling is around using computers. They had a whole bunch of people in a lab using a computer, and they were asked how the computer did, and everyone is, for the task they were assigned, and everyone says, yeah, the computer's fine, it works fine. And then they were asked, well, how much is this computer worth? Only some people were told that their computer's name was Julie, and some people were told that their computer's name is James. And apparently James' computer is worth more than Julie's computer, even though they all perform the same function. So the reason I show these different examples is to say, look, these issues, the bias that we're talking about, that we're trying to overcome in Engendering Success, is embedded in all the different ways that the economy functions. And so we need to therefore think about unpacking, undoing these systems in all the ways that the economy functions. Of course, this is in part because of implicit bias. Most of you have done have done the implicit bias test? Yeah, so all of you know about this. So, millions of people have taken this test. I have to concentrate really hard to not fall into this, but if I concentrate, I can be at the no preference side of this thing. Associating women with family, men with careers is just something that is socialized into us from a very young age, which is why one of the pillars of ESS is about how do we unsocialize people from a very young age. This is not just about gender, this is also about race. And if you go to the implicit association test, you might have done the gender one, but I don't know how many of the other ones. There's like many, many different tests that you can do, all of which cause you to hate yourself because, it's very hard to, we're just like, these are embedded in us. And for me, it's not just like it's embedded in our brains, if only we could change our brains. We basically, kind of hard to change our brains. So the key is how can we change all the systems and structures and processes and ways of doing business around that? Because if we spend all of our time trying to get people to change their brains, that's just going to be very hard. All I do, I'm like rabidly doing this stuff on inequality all the time, and yet I still, and I've only had a woman doctor ever in my entire life, except for the dude who delivered me, and I don't remember him because I was just born. And yet when someone says doctor, I always 100% picture a man. And this is someone who thinks about these issues all the time, working really hard on this. So changing the brain hard, changing the systems, processes, structures, education, all these other kinds of things, that's what we've got to work on. So what I want to talk about then is how this gets embedded in all sorts of decisions that get made about product and service design, and to see if we can undo those. So this is an example of a study that was done about who gets injured in car accidents. And if you've read Invisible Women by Carolyn Criado Perez, you'll know that she was a wonderful book. She popularized a lot of different things, including the results that women are 47% more likely to be injured in a car accident if they get in a car accident. Now, women are less likely to get in car accidents, but if they do get in a car accident, they're much more likely to be injured. Why? Because car seats have been designed with male body types in mind. And the crash test dummies have historically been male-sized, and when people said, hey, gee, women drive too, they just made a smaller male-sized crash test dummy, which doesn't really work, because actually, women's bodies are different shapes and have different, ways that they can be impacted by accidents. So this is an example of a study that was done that looked at 4 different kinds of car seats, and each of the bars is, ooh, I'm getting a little feedback. Each of the bars is how much more a woman would be injured in an accident than a man. And you can see in a lot of these, for most of the cars, women are being more injured, whether it's all those little technical things down there are different ways of measuring like a way that you could get injured. So for most of the seats, you could see that women are getting more injured than men, but some of the seats no. So why wouldn't we have car seats that are not disadvantaging women? This is just one example of how something like automotive design was not taking into account things like gender. Fitbits, Apple Watches, things like that. Well, if they can do things like measure your heart rate or measure whether you've exercised. Mine's constantly reminding me to stand up, like all these kinds of things. I'll be in the middle of a flight, we're like landing, it's like, stand up. I'm like, well, not right now. But a lot of, in the United States, health insurance companies are saying, if you wear a Fitbit and you do this stuff and exercise, we're going to give you like a discount on your health insurance. Well, it turns out that these things do not work as well on dark skin because it relies on that little green light that goes in, and if you have darker pigmentation, that little green light is not going to work as well. So if you're connecting health outcomes or insurance policy rates or things like that to the use of this, and it doesn't work as well for certain kinds of people, that is a problem. And you can imagine the people who are designing it, who's designing it, they're like, oh, it works fine on me. So again, thinking about a product design that is not made for everyone. Similarly, there was a technology company trying to use AI. I'm not going to talk too much about AI, just a few little examples, to make recommendations on who should get what kind, help doctors make better decisions about who's going to get a certain kind of treatment. And they built an algorithm that included all sorts of things like past cost of serving this patient and things like that. Well, it turns out that this algorithm that was meant to help doctors make recommendations pretty systematically recommended that white patients get the more complex, expensive treatment and black patients got the less complex, less expensive treatment. And the reason was that they built into the system this idea of the cost of the patient. Well, why might black patients have historically had lower costs? One, they tend not to seek out health care as much because they don't trust the system. They tend not to be given some of the treatments that they should get. So they may not have the resources to seek out health care. And so you have an algorithm that's actually producing exactly the result it was trying to fix because the data it was based on created amplified inequality. Or another example, facial recognition technology. It's being used everywhere. I just boarded a plane yesterday where I just looked at a thing and then it let me on the plane. I didn't show ID. I didn't do anything. This is being used everywhere. Well, it's been shown, and there was studies, if you haven't followed Joy Buolamwini, she's terrific and you can see her TED Talk and all kinds of things. A PhD out of MIT who basically found that the facial recognition wouldn't recognize her face because she's a black woman. And so she did a study to show that these technologies are really bad at, again, recognizing darker faces, and particularly darker women's faces. And of course, because these technologies are being used in policing, we now have many, many cases of people being wrongfully identified by these systems. So again, now, she did this study and actually went to IBM and said, hey, bad news. And they were like, hey, we're going to try to fix this. And they have. Like, they have gotten much better because they trained on different kinds of data. But without thinking about it, they were training on data that was going to lead to these kinds of outcomes. So these are the kinds of biases that can be built into products and services that we may not be thinking about. And that's one of the things we're trying to change. So you probably remember in 2015, Justin Trudeau, he had a gender-balanced cabinet for the first time in the history of Canada, and people asked him why, and he said, because it's 2015. And okay, it's 2023, we're still not there. It's like still no gender equality, but we're getting there. I wrote an article in 2017 saying, because it's 2017, let's try to really make progress. And I started to think about this question of gender equality as potentially being an innovation challenge. We tend to have our best and brightest doing the product and service innovation in organizations, but then we say the diversity, equity, inclusion, we throw over to the HR team and we say, you deal with it, we're the fancy product and service people. And what I'm trying to say is, can we integrate that? And even when we're thinking about organizational change for equity and inclusion, could we be innovative there? So can we not stop doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different outcome is basically what I'm trying to say. So every year I change the number, and pretty soon it'll be 24, and I will change this number again. Okay, so let me give you some examples of organizations that then have tried to do something different. So here's Volvo. Here's a pregnant crash test dummy, because it turns out pregnant women drive cars. And so they now test their cars on all sorts of different body types to make sure that the safety of the vehicle is one that works for everybody. Great example there. Elevest. This is an organization started by Sally Krawcheck. She'd spent many years on Wall Street, Citibank, other places, gotten beaten down by the system, basically, founded a company called Elevest because she realized that the financial services industry was not meeting the needs of women investors for many, many reasons. One, because women's income patterns tend to be very different from men's, because often they take more time out if they are having children, or we say people who are having children take more time out from work and therefore may have income interruptions. We know that women tend to be segregated into job categories or industries where the pay is lower. We know that women tend to work longer and live longer. All those kinds of factors would actually affect what kinds of investment recommendations you might make to someone. We also know that, at least historically, women have tended to want to invest their money with their values more than men tend to want to invest their money with their values. So they developed this is a fintech. They developed an app, a whole technology. It uses AI. I keep putting in quotes because it's like, I don't even know, am I AI? Like pretty soon we won't even know. We're basically at Blade Runner. We just don't know it yet. But anyway, this is a technology, a fintech technology that is meant for, they welcome all investors, but it's really tailored towards women investors. That's meeting them where they are, helping and providing products and services and recommendations for women in a different way. And it's been a huge success, lots of venture capital investment. It's a niche it's seen as a niche in the market. Most banks are saying it's just a niche, but it turns out it's a very big market because women are apparently half of the population or more, so we might be wanting to worry about them. Banks always disregarded it because they called it a niche, and what Elevest is showing is that this is actually a really important market opportunity. Or one of my favorite examples, Gate wrote a case study. We wrote a case study of Elevest also. Wrote a case study on McCarthy uniforms. Our executive in residence, Vanessa Iarocci, came in to be CEO to turn around this company that sells school uniforms and bus uniforms bus driver uniforms, not bus uniforms, buses don't wear uniforms, but bus driver uniforms, construction uniforms, and things like that. And she was said, you have 4 years to turn, she was told you have 4 years to turn around this company. She decided to apply a gender lens to this, and she looked at the marketplace and she saw things like school uniforms are always sold unhemmed because different kids are different height, and they just expect that someone at home is busy hemming the pants or the skirt. No one has time for that. No one even knows how to hem anymore. So how is this happening? So then, they introduced hemming tape so that you would just get the product, you would just put the tape on, iron it, and you would be ready to go. And this led her to win many more contracts at schools because it was a product that was going to be more useful to families. Similarly, bus driver uniforms, many bus companies just tell the women, just wear the men's clothing, but if women have bigger hips, then they put on the clothing that fits. It comes out to here. It's very uncomfortable. The first time a woman bus driver tested one of the woman-sized bus uniforms, she cried because it was the first time she'd ever had a uniform that fit her. So what net effect? McCarthy Uniforms turns around in 2 years, not 4, because they actually applied a gender lens to how they go to market. And also, she was thinking about everything that happened inside the organization as well, but this is on how to go to market. Another example, MasterCard, recognizing that many people are assigned the wrong gender at birth and want to realize their actual gender. And so they've created a product that allows people to use their true name on their credit card and not necessarily the one that's on their birth certificate. Another opportunity to meet the needs of a marketplace that is really, really not well served. Or Reina condominiums, we have a case study coming out on this as well. In Toronto, this was an all-woman development team, the first ever all-woman development team, architects, developers, planners, everyone, and they went through and designed a condo complex with lots of community consultation in order to be able to create something that really met the needs of families in a way that they had not been met before. So these are just some examples of what we're calling gender analytics. It says gender, but what we really mean is intersectional approach to thinking about products and services. So analyzing the products and services and processes to uncover all these hidden opportunities for innovation or to avoid downside risks like the ones that we saw in the car making. And then to discover how all of these intersecting identities can shape those risks, opportunities, and impacts. And so we had a whole conference on this in the spring, so I'm going to give you the one slide of what we said in the conference, which is first thinking about how the data that you use are produced, like that algorithm example, really going inside that, qualitative and quantitatively, collecting disaggregated data, forcing that to happen, using the qualitative and quantitative data to generate these inclusive insights, and then incorporating these insights into the design of what product service policy. If you're a government policymaker, this is what they call GBA+. It's the same thing, but we're applying it more in the business context. And then importantly throughout this collaborating and co-creating with users, constituencies, and stakeholders as a really crucial, this is a nothing about us without us kind of approach, really engaging with those communities. So you have on your table a postcard. This is one side of the postcard. The other side of the postcard is another executive program that we offer, that Sonia offers, that's about the inclusion inside the organization. And this course that we're just literally launching today, the first cohort will be February 5th. We're launching today a course that's actually going to aimed at helping people learn how to do this, because we've done a lot of consultation and we know that it's really hard to think in this way when doing product and service design. And so we're really excited to think about how to bring these skills to everyone. So I said I would come back to this while flipping the script, because what I believe is that if we spend a whole bunch of time on inclusive product service program, policy design, and all of that, we are going to be running to the HR team demanding more diversity on our teams, because you can't do this with teams that are not diverse. And so, for a long time, I talk to people in the corporate world, they often say, the HR team feels like we're just trying to jam diversity down the throats of the people who are in the business, right? Well, if the people in the business are doing this, then the HR team is going to be the center of the conversation. And even more importantly, when you hire people who increase the diversity of the organization, instead of just thinking, we talk about diversity, inclusion, and even belonging, instead of just even focus on belonging, we're putting those people at the center, not just belonging to the existing system, but at the center of a new system of an organization that's trying to really design products and services in ways that will actually put their insights. We need some other word that's like diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and at the center. You know, we need a C or something like that, because that's what I think this is going to do if organizations would really pay attention to it. So the late, great Kathy Phillips talked about how diversity makes us smarter, and she said it makes us smarter because only if we do the hard work. And it's like exercise, no pain, no gain. This requires hard work. And what we're trying to do is encourage organizations to engage in that kind of hard work, because the upside is really huge. So thank you very much for the opportunity to start off your day today. And I really look forward to hearing what all of you have to present today and all the ideas that are going to come out of this. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm happy to kick off our first panel session on barriers and bridges to inclusion. I'm Andy Barron. I'll be moderating this session. Just to give you a heads up, what we're going to do is I'll quickly introduce all 4 speakers, and then we're going to invite them up one at a time to present. And then after, we're going to have a Q&A session. And just as a reminder, with the Q&A session, you're using Slido. It's important that you put the name that the question is directed to. As moderator at the end, I'll then go through and make sure we try to get through as many as possible. But you can vote on them. So there's a way, as a community, we can effectively elevate the questions that we most want to hear from. So if we can't get to all of them, at least we can try to prioritize them in that democratic fashion. So again, just make sure you put the name down for folks. That'd be very helpful. So we have an all-star lineup today. It's really a who's who of international experts in bias, and then a who's that of a moderator. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Sapna Cheryan, and she's from the University of Washington. And she's going to be talking with us today about the foundational cultural biases and how they're rooted in masculine defaults. And I think if I say anything more about it, I'll just be mansplaining, so I'll stop right there. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Steven Spencer. While he is affiliated with The Ohio State University, I really think in his heart of hearts, he's a Wolverine, having done his work at Michigan, where I did my undergrad work. His talk's going to be focusing on how helping us understand when we should intervene and how we should intervene when a person experiences identity threat. Identity threat is something I experienced when I read the CVs of everyone who's presenting in this panel. Our third speaker is going to be Dr. Buju Dasgupta, and she's from UMass Amherst, and really special to me for 2 reasons. One, we share an advisor in Mahzarin Banaji, and that was a very formidable time in my life that really shaped who I am as a scientist as well as a mentor. So it's really cool to have that connection. But also, whereas I study the origins of bias in early childhood and implicit bias and how we can change it, she's done all the groundbreaking work with adults and older kids that has informed all the work that I do. So I probably cite you more than anyone else that I know. And she'll be looking at how different social motives can influence our decisions to pursue STEM or to avoid STEM. And so she'll be taking a more broader perspective, holistic view in that work. And then finally, our fourth speaker is going to be Dr. Jennifer Steele, who's from York University, and also perhaps my favorite collaborator. Essentially everything that I do in my lab, we're collaborating on, with the exception of my work on infancy and bias. And she's going to be taking a step back and looking at how intersectionality in the case of gender and race stereotypes can uniquely influence the kinds of suggestions and recommendations that we have for overcoming barriers to inclusion in STEM. And so please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Sapna Cheryan. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's so great to see all of you, so many familiar faces and new people I'm looking forward to meeting later. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I'm going to be speaking about some work we have that's relatively recent, last 3 or 4 years in my lab. And at the end, I'm going to talk about some work we're doing very, very currently, so in the middle of data collection. And I wanted to start with a slide that was released for International Women's Day this year, looking at how women have been or not been incorporated into leadership positions around the world. So these are some global figures. And this is looking at industry, so CEOs and across different industries, and then also looking at education. And what you can see is that when you're looking at the very top leadership, we are seeing that women are just almost absent at these very high levels. It's a little bit better when you get into university leadership and then get into tenured academic positions. And then it's not that women are not working at all. Of course, they're working. They're about half the labor market in the US at least, but they're concentrated into particular occupations. Just out of curiosity, I decided to pull some Canadian numbers too. I always like to learn a little bit more about the context that I'm entering, and you can see that this is a percentage of undergraduate degrees that go to women in engineering fields in Canada, and it's very similar to what we just saw, where women are underrepresented overall, especially in fields that are more computer-oriented, mechanical, electrical. So in my research, I'm really interested in why. So why do women continue to be underrepresented in so many of these high status and lucrative fields, and what can we do to change that? And one common factor and one thing that certainly exists is this idea of discrimination and bias, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But when we think about discrimination and bias in psychology and other social sciences, and I think in our culture more broadly, we define it like this, as differential treatment. So women are treated as worse in some way, they're judged more negatively, they're seen as less competent, they're harassed. And all these things are super, super important. They're things that I've studied and that have been established as factors that prevent women from entering and remaining in a lot of male-dominated fields. But what I want to suggest today is that there's another form of bias, one that might be harder to see, but I think is very important in explaining why women continue to be so underrepresented. Actually, hold on. First, I want to show you a figure. So this is a figure of what we depict differential treatment to look like, which is when a door is open to a man that's not open to a woman. So he gets a job, he's hired, he's given a promotion, he's given a pay raise. Okay, now I'm going to show you the second form of bias, and this is something that we're calling masculine defaults. And this is a form of bias in which characteristics and behaviors associated with the male gender role are valued, rewarded, or seen as standard or necessary. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about what I mean by the male gender role. So as you all probably know, in our society, we generally divide gender roles into 2 categories, male and female. This is not an accurate reflection of gender. We know that gender is a lot more complicated, and it's a spectrum, and there's more than 2 genders. But this is one of the problems with gender roles. It reduces everybody to one of 2 categories. The second problem is that it ascribes certain characteristics and traits to each gender role. So men are expected to be things like self-promoting, self-reliant, assertive, independent, etc. Women are expected to be more other-oriented, other-promoting, nurturing, agreeable, interdependent, etc. And masculine defaults exist when the characteristics associated with the male gender role are rewarded or valued or kind of seen as normal or standard in a certain environment. So whereas the door was open to a man and not open to a woman in differential treatment, okay, never mind, the figure must be after this. So why do masculine defaults disadvantage women? So there's really 3 reasons why masculine defaults disadvantage women. First, some masculine characteristics and behaviors may be relatively rarer in women than in men. So you can think of an example like self-promotion. Women are often not socialized to self-promote. So when environment rewards self-promotion, women may end up finding that more difficult. Google actually released some data several years ago showing that women were less likely to get promoted at Google, and they found that the reason for that is because at Google you have to raise your hand to be promoted. You have to say that you're ready to be promoted, and what ended up happening is that women, even if they were equally qualified to men, they were less likely to do this kind of self-promotion. The second reason is that masculine characteristics may not be recognized. So even when women have the masculine characteristics to the same extent as men, they may be not recognized for having them. So this is research that we've seen on when people send out resumes, and the resumes are going to STEM faculty, for example, and the qualifications are equal, women are less likely to be seen as competent in STEM. And finally, women who, even if you have those characteristics and are recognized for them, there's this third thing that happens, which is you could get punished for them. So women may face backlash for fitting the male gender role. And this is especially true for dominance-related characteristics. Okay, here's the figure. So whereas the door was open for men and not for women, here we see that the door is open for both men and women. So it looks like there's no differential treatment happening on the surface, but the environment is set up in such a way that it makes it harder for women to enter and be successful. So why do we need to learn about masculine defaults? Why is this important to distinguish it from differential treatment? And I'll give you a concrete example. So imagine that you have a team, maybe you're a PI or you're a manager, and on this team you've noticed that the women tend to get interrupted more than the men. And this would be a classic differential treatment finding. It's been shown that women tend to get interrupted more often than men, even all the way up to Supreme Court justices. So you decide to do something about it, you decide to fix it. So you start counting, and every time that a woman is interrupted, you interrupt a man, so to produce equality of interruption. So you have eliminated differential treatment. Now women and men are getting interrupted at exactly the same rate. Have you eliminated bias? So we would argue that, well, you probably have gotten rid of differential treatment, but you may have introduced a second bias, this masculine default, where now interruption is valued, it's seen as the right way to operate in an environment, and you're modeling it as a leader. And that could be especially difficult for women who are socialized often not to interrupt and get backlash when they do. So in our paper, we tried to pull together a bunch of empirical examples of masculine defaults, and this is a paper I co-wrote with Hazel Marcus a few years ago. I'm not going to go through all the examples, take way too long, and I'm actually only going to go through one example, and only very briefly, but you're welcome to open the paper if you want to see like a whole bunch of examples. The example I wanted to, this is some of the examples. The example I wanted to point to is some work that we've done in our lab in the past. And the reason I want to point to this is because this is why I got interested in masculine defaults. So in our past work, we've shown that the way that environments are set up, like computer science classrooms or companies, can cause women to feel lower or higher belonging in computer science depending on how they're designed. So when they fit current computer science stereotypes like their Star Trek posters or junk food or video games, women feel a lower sense of belonging when those same environments are redesigned to have things like nature posters and art posters, things that are more gender neutral. And the reason that I got interested in masculine defaults is because while I was doing that work, I always kind of had this sense of like, am I studying a form of bias or am I not? Is this discrimination to have Star Trek posters? Not really, because it's not like Star Trek posters are discriminating against women. Junk food is not like sexist. But I had this sense that it was having a lot of the same outcomes that we've seen with bias. And so that got me to start thinking about how you can have bias in environments or in beliefs or in ideas, interactions, even if you don't have differential treatment. And that's what got me down this path of writing this paper. So as I'm coming to the end here, I want to just briefly touch upon how to change masculine defaults. How do you actually deal with them if you've identified them in your organization or your classroom? And we talk a lot about this in the paper. We talk about how to identify them and then how to, the multiple strategies to change them. I'm just going to focus on one strategy, and that is the strategy of getting rid of them, of dismantling the masculine default. There are other things that you can do if you can't. Sometimes you cannot get rid of masculine defaults for many reasons. And so we talk about other strategies such as balancing the masculine default with a feminine default. But I'm going to focus on just if you identify one and you want to get rid of it, how can you do that? And I'll give you an example from Harvey Mudd, which is a small engineering-focused school in Southern California. And what they did is they noticed in their department that they had a strong masculine default, that was that they really valued people who had prior programming experience. So the students who came in who already knew how to code were seen as better students. They were seen as more likely to be successful. They were doing better in their classes. And this is a problem because the people who are most likely to come in with prior programming experience are boys. In the US, computer science is still largely optional in high schools if it's offered at all. And extracurricularly, boys are more likely to learn coding. They're also more likely to take these classes. And so they wanted to get rid of this masculine default. What they did is they decided to take their intro class, which had previously been kind of geared towards people who already had programming experience, and divide it into 2 classes. And they took one class and they said, anybody who does not have prior programming experience or very little can come into this class. Anybody who has prior programming experience can come into this other class. There was no test. It was self-selection. They didn't value them differently. They called them the gold class and the black class. And they got to the same place at the end of the class so that the students could enter on the same level. But what this ended up doing is it created a classroom environment for students who didn't have prior programming experience where they felt like there's a place for me in this department. It's less intimidating because I'm not, hearing the questions of all these students who've come in with all this knowledge who are, doing better than me in the class. And it was one way that really helped eliminate masculine defaults. They did a little bit of training with the faculty, showing the faculty how to interrupt students who had that kind of intimidation factor. But by and large, the way that faculty ended up changing their minds is they ended up seeing that a lot of the students who ended up doing very well in their program are students who had come in without prior programming experience through this gold class. And that was what ended up changing a lot of the beliefs. So I'm going to talk about two current directions we're doing in our lab. So this idea of defaults can be extended to a lot of identities. And right now, with a current postdoc of mine, Dr. Greg Murugishi, we're studying whiteness. So how do white defaults get embedded in different parts of our society, and how does that impact people of color? And then with Dr. Alexandra Garschultz, who is a former postdoc in my lab now, assistant professor at University of Connecticut, we are looking at racialized gender roles. I'm going to just briefly, I have like a minute, but I'll quickly go into this because one of my frustrations while writing this, my future work is always based on the frustrations of my current work. So one of my frustrations of this masculine defaults paper is that when I went back and read the gender roles literature again, I realized how much of it was really based on white samples and white researchers. And when I was looking at these traits, I started to wonder, are these gender roles or are these more like white American gender roles? And it turns out, we have data now, they're more like white American gender roles, and if you look at different racial and ethnic groups, there's quite different gender role content that comes up. I would love to go into this in more detail if I had another 45 minutes, but I don't, so feel free to ask me about it later. I even have word clouds I could show you on my computer and at the back of these slides. Very interesting stuff. Okay, so let me wrap up here. So what masculine defaults does, one of the goals of it is to make visible the privileging of masculinity. And one of my larger goals in my work is to shift explanations for disparities away from individuals, what's going on in individuals' heads or their behaviors, and really look at cultures overall and how we can change cultures in order to change society and decrease disparities. And always important to me is not only identifying these things, but making change and figuring out how we can make environments better for women so that we have a more equal society. Thank you very much.
Just as a reminder, you can submit questions via Slido. We'll do the Q&A at the end after the fourth speaker is presented.
All right. I should begin this talk by acknowledging that really Katie Kroper deserves way more credit for this than me. It's a project that we've worked on for a couple of years. I should even admit, except for a few ugly slides like this one, all the slides are even Katie's that I stole from a talk that she gave earlier this week at University of Connecticut. What I want to talk about is a new scale that we've developed. And what this scale measures is social identity threat for a particular group in a particular context. And it turns out that that becomes a very powerful measurement. And what I want to argue is it can give us good ideas about where to intervene and how to intervene if we're going to do interventions. The basic idea is that we often don't know really what's on the ground happening with people in a situation, and we really need to know more about that if we're going to have good interventions. And if we look at all the big interventions that have happened in the world, belonging interventions, mindset interventions, and so forth, what we see is there's a whole lot of variance in how well they work. There's a lot of heterogeneity, and I'm hoping that by taking this approach, we can explain that heterogeneity and know when we really should intervene and how we should. Okay, so social identity threat is the concept that we're interested in. This is work that came out of Claude Steele's original work on stereotype threat, and then we kind of revised it over time to realize that some groups have identity threat that isn't tied to a particular stereotype. It's more tied to group membership. So social identity threat is a broader category. Stereotype threat is a subcategory within that. And so people are vigilant to the possibility of being devalued or mistrusted due to their social identity. So the idea is if you have this, if you have an identity of which people may treat you negatively because of it, they might devalue you because of it. It's a threat in the air is what Claude described it as, and that's what we're really trying to capture with this measure, a threat in the air. It's not, I've experienced discrimination, it's, I might, I could, I'm concerned, and we actually designed all of the items to capture that type of threat. So it's also contextual. When you have that threat, you have it in some situations, like on the left up here, you have a woman going into an environment like that, where they're all men, and you could imagine really high social identity threat, or you can imagine a different context where you'd have very low social identity threat. So as we measure social identity threat, we have context in it at every point as well. And this is where Katie really, the brilliance of what she did, we actually have 23 different types of scenarios where you can feel stereotype or social identity threat. Where you can have respect concerns, fairness concerns, value concerns, concerns about whether you can pass as being the person you want in that situation. There's 23 different concerns, and I think it's a fairly exhaustive list as we're looking at it, and I think that's important for knowing how to intervene. Which of these things do people feel in the context in which they feel social identity threat? Okay. One of the things that we want to think about when we think about interventions is shifting from an identity-threatening situation to an identity-safe setting, and that requires understanding. And really comes about thinking about social identities as an asset rather than as a problem in that situation. So we're really asking, do people feel welcome, supported, and valued, whatever their background? So it's tied to belonging, but it's broader identity safety that we'd want to do in an actual intervention. Okay. And I think this new paper by Mary Murphy, who's also one of the co-authors on this and very much involved, Katie's PhD, and also Katie's PhD advisor. So Katie brought Mary and I together on this, something we wanted to work together for a long time. So some scholars have misunderstood what threat is, and how it functions. And they conflate the phenomenon or experience of stereotype threat with a particular outcome, performance. And lots of people have said, when do you know when you have stereotype threat? Well, if you have performance effects. And that's just doesn't make sense, because the theory itself predicts that there's a lot of times you won't get performance deficits. So this is more a direct measure of social identity threat, which will be true whether there's performance or not. And it allows a new question: when you have social identity threats, when do you have performance effects and when don't you? And it allows us to test that more directly. So how do we measure the social identity threat concerns? We have identity flexibility. So what that means by that is we specify what identity in that setting do you feel social identity threat for. It has contextual sensitivity. So within the question each time, we specify a given context. It is broad focused, so it's at a relatively high level of construal as you're feeling about this, and we articulate it as a threat in the air. So what does that look? And we have these 23 different concerns and pressures. Pressures to assimilate, pressures for our people think you're privileged in that environment. Privilege doesn't just mean groups that are privileged. For example, a lot of marginalized students have privilege concerns that they're there for affirmative action. That's also a privilege concern that somebody would have in the environment. Spotlighting concerns: are people going to focus on me? Am I a token? Do I have trust concerns? So we have measures on each of these items. And boy, I wish I could see what it can have all kinds of different things like political orientation. And boy, we can see better from here. We have things like race, we have social economic status, all of those different things. And what this started with pilot testing that Katie did, and looked at the different things. We started with open-ended things that people had for different things where they felt social identity threat. And we looked at exactly the things that they said, and on a bunch of different race, political orientation, this is stereotype threat. They feel like they could be stereotyped in that environment, of all those 23 concerns. And from there, we had, we developed a set of 23 items. So I'm not going to go into the scale development too much here, but here's an example of social identity threat concerns, like sometimes I'm not sure that people think I belong or fit in my physics class because of my gender. So what we substitute in there is physics class is the context, and gender is a social identity, and that's a belonging concern, or belonging uncertainty. Because of my gender, I sometimes wonder whether others in my physics class will give me a fair shot. That's a fairness concern. In my physics class, I sometimes concern that someone will single me out or shine a spotlight on me because of my gender, spotlighting concerns. We can do this for different groups and just switch it. This one, I got somebody here so I can read this actually. Sometimes I'm not sure that people think I belong or fit in religious and spiritual settings because of my sexuality. If you want to wander, you can have this one. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. I naturally wander lots. Oh, there's actually a screen here. Trish is telling you, idiot, there's a screen right there, and I'm trying to read up here. Okay, and because of my race ethnicity, I sometimes wonder whether others in my workplace will give me a fair shot. And that's obviously one about race. And again, we have a particular setting in the workplace, and at my university, I'm sometimes concerned that someone will single me out or shine a spotlight on me because of my political orientation. So this gives you how we can change the scale. Real quickly, it has great psychometric properties. It has an alpha of like 0.97 because we have 23 items. So it's like really high. Good confirmatory factor analysis and a bunch of other statistics that Katie understands and I don't. Okay, so to some actual data and what this looks like. This is one that very relevant to ESS. We look at social identity threat for gender based on different places, different contexts for women. With my friendship group, there's very little difference between men and women. At college, we start to see a difference between men and women in social identity threat, which is kind of small. In internet forums, it's a little bigger. And in science classes, it starts to become quite large, at least medium to large effect size. We can then look at, which is interesting, and this is, what this would suggest to me is where we most need to intervene is in classrooms, in science and math classrooms. What this is, and I'm not going to go in detail here, these are the 23 items. And where do you feel, where do women report feeling social identity threat, the types of social identity threat they concern? And look at internet forums, second to the bottom, and on the left side is women, and on the right side is men. And internet forums, very different concerns, or at least somewhat different concerns than in science and gender classrooms. That suggests that you would want different types of interventions in different types of contexts. I'll give you another example here, sexuality and different contexts. So we see that LGBTQ plus compared to heterosexual people, there's some difference in social identity threat even within the friend groups. This is, at college in general, is almost as large as our gender effects in the classroom. With my extended family, it gets to be a very large effect size, a D of 2. And if we look at in religious and spiritual settings, like this massive effect size, we see these differences. And when you look at the different profiles, we see that with friends and family, with friends and family, the top two on the left, it's those pink ones are actually things about whether they'll be found out, whether transparency and those kinds of things. Those matter throughout, but that's the primary concerns in the top. In the bottom, we see like concerns across the board. All kinds of, almost all 23 are showing up in the larger settings. But again, what this analysis lets us do is to think, okay, what context and then what are the specific concerns and how would we address them to help people feel like this could be an environment in which they could thrive. Another thing here that you got to keep in mind, I think, is when you look at interventions, when we look at those bottom two with such threat across the board, it's obvious that you're not going to provide people ways of thinking their way out of this sort of environment, that the environment's going to need to be changed. So one of the things that you can begin to look at is when you have threat way across the board, strategies to think about that threat are probably not going to be very helpful. Strategies could be helpful for moderate to low threat, and relatively specific types of threat, but when you see this broad threat across the board, well, that's a clear indication that that's going to be the type of environment that the type of things we've done probably aren't going to work. So when we think about a mindset intervention or a belonging intervention, that's not going to work. The belonging work in particular suggests that you need to have affordances in the environment that make you think you can belong there. Well, if we look at the bottom left, there isn't any affordances there. There's no way that sort of belonging intervention is going to work in that, for LGBTQ plus people in a spiritual or religious setting. There's just too much. There's not a place where you can feel like you belong. When we talked about this in Women in Engineering here in Canada, we often remember talking to Mary Wells about the mining sector. The mining sector, female engineers regularly report that they're sexually harassed. A belonging manipulation, just give your time, feel like you fit in to find your niche when you're being sexually harassed. That's not going to work. And this sort of broad threat like that is not going to work when the environment doesn't afford any sense of belonging. Okay, this one is with race, and we have people of color and white people, and we have majority white settings, and we have racially diverse settings. We have some data where we actually have majority people of color settings where it totally crosses over. But just this data which we have, you see there's huge differences in majority white settings. Look at the huge difference in that context between social identity threat. This isn't going to be an easy place to intervene when it's that big. The differences are that big. And we can see that, again, other than the transparency things, for race, transparency and whether people will recognize who you are is not much of a concern, but everything else is really high. That suggests you're going to need change in the environment in those predominantly white settings. Whereas when it's a more racially diverse area, there's actually more room for intervention, less of the high threat across the board. All right, and I'm told I have 0 minutes left. Okay, so I will just I will skip the last one that I was going to talk about with different types of physics classes, and I think I'll skip the implications as well. I think that's clear. So. Okay, so we can measure the social identity threat. We don't have to rely on performance to indicate when people are having social identity threat. We can we can determine where the intervention needs to happen, and we can begin to identify the nature of social identity threat in those situations as a way to actually intervene. So, try not to take too much of Ruby's time.
Thank you so much.
This is the clicker, and if you want the mic.
No, I think I'm good. This was designed well because it's short enough for me. Steve is super tall, and I always think a design problem is the lectern at the place. So you'll see me as Nilanjana, and you'll see me as Bushu, if you wondered how to pronounce it. It's Nilanjana, not Nilanjana. Anyway, so what I'm going to try and do is only 15 minutes. I'm going to give you a tapas menu of all kinds of stuff we do in our lab that has to do with sort of gender and in the context of STEM. So, and I also want to sort of thank this ESS consortium, and I'm super excited about all of the potential ideas and maybe potential collaborations that could come out of it. So just wanted to plant the seed. All right, so we humans are social animals, and we rely on relationships to survive and thrive. And there are a few core motivations that drive our cognition, our emotion, our behavior across a wide variety of contexts. The need to belong. As Steve was talking about, we tend to gravitate towards environment where we feel we fit in, and we drift away from others where we feel like misfits. The need to feel competent. We tend to pursue activities where we feel a sense of mastery, and we leave others where we feel some self-doubt. And finally, the need for meaning or purpose. We tend to pursue and stay in paths that are personally meaningful and have a lot of, give us a sense of purpose. So these core motivations guide our behavior across many social contexts. And in my lab, one of the things we do is to design and test interventions where we can test the impacts of these interventions that tap into the social motives. And some of it is on STEM, some of it is not, so I'm just going to focus on STEM for now. So the impact of these social motives on students and people's decisions to pursue or avoid STEM is often underestimated. We assume that ability is all that's needed for success in STEM, and we assume, as sort of Steve cued very nicely, we often assume that high performance is the best metric of ability, and that young people who leave STEM pathways must not have what it takes. Either they don't have the ability, or perhaps the interest, or perhaps the endurance. But we know, and this is a lot of the research of people in this room, that people with ability in STEM often approach these activities in the first place. The question is, do they stay? And whether or not they stay depends on the fulfillment of these social motives. And that strong performance isn't sufficient for persistence if the need to belong is not satisfied, if people don't feel competent, and if they don't feel that is personally meaningful to them. So for people who are minoritized in STEM, approaching these pathways or these spaces often activates negative stereotypes about their group. Those stereotypes combined with being one of very few is what sort of increases the risk of attrition. So the question we were interested in my lab is to identify or figure out what sort of factors will allow people to deflect these stereotypes, satisfy these social motives, and to allow people to pursue high achievement pathways despite these stereotypes. And this is what led me to develop this model that I call the stereotype inoculation model. Back in 2011, I didn't know how relevant it would be today. But the general idea of this model is just as biomedical vaccines protect and inoculate our physical body against noxious bacteria and viruses, so too, I argue, that particular features of social environments protect and inoculate our mind against noxious stereotypes. So those situational features are the social vaccines. So what do I mean by situational features? Here are 4 types. 1, representation. Who do you see, even if you don't know them? Seeing in-group members who are successful is one such social vaccine. 2, relationships. Having even one person who is successful, who is potentially a peer, with whom you have a real relationship, is another social vaccine. A sense of community or camaraderie with people with a shared identity is a third social vaccine. And 4 is creating a space where STEM is connected to something that is personally meaningful, is another social vaccine. So what I want to do is to, in the spirit of tapas menus, give you 3 examples, one on relationships, one on community, one on meaning. So in terms of these relationships, we started about maybe a decade ago with this interest in the transition from high school to college and how in those periods of transition, young people experience the most self-doubt and uncertainty. And we wondered if introducing a peer mentor in that transition period would act as a social vaccine. And is it enough to just have any peer mentor, or do you need somebody of your own sex? So we designed a randomized controlled field experiment in engineering, where women in the US are 15 or 20% of engineering majors. We randomly assigned them as the summer before they were entering college to either have a female peer mentor or male peer mentor, or in the business as usual, no peer mentor. Mentor-mentees met couple times in the fall, couple times in the spring, and the mentors then, I should say, they were all volunteered, and they were all excellent. They were trained, and they were really good. And because this question comes up when you see the graph. And then the mentors graduated. We kept track of the mentees as baseline before mentor assignment, all through that first year when the mentoring was active, and then once a year, every year, until the mentees graduated, 1 year post-graduation. So let me show you what we found. So this is students' sense of belonging as a function of who their mentors were. What you can see from the black line are students who had a female peer mentor. Their feelings of belonging in engineering held steady across that first year in college. Women in the other two conditions showed a sharp decline in their belonging in engineering all through that first year. Similar pattern for self-efficacy in engineering. Women who had female peer mentors, their sense of self-efficacy held steady across that whole year, dropped sharply in the control condition. The male mentor condition sort of hung around in the middle, non-significantly different from the controls. Do you want to go to grad school in engineering? Same pattern of data. Holds steady for the same-sex peer mentors, drops sharply in the other two conditions. At the end of that first year in college, 100% of the women who had female peer mentors were still in engineering. That number dropped to the 80s in the other two conditions. So this is the first year. Then the mentors graduate. We keep tracking the mentees' progress till 1 year post-graduation. How long does the vaccination last? Well, it lasts 5 years after the mentors have gone. So those women who originally had female peer mentors, the black line, their self-efficacy in engineering holds steady, whereas it drops sharply in the other two groups. Motivation to persist in engineering careers holds steady if you originally had a female peer mentors, and drops sharply in the other two groups. In engineering, you might know that internships are super important to get a placement in post-graduation. Women who originally had female peer mentors were far more successful at securing and completing internships than those in the other two conditions. They were more likely to be in engineering majors or allied majors at graduation instead of having switched out than the other two conditions. So on behavioral measures, on psychological measures, immediately while the mentoring was active, 5 years later, on multiple metrics, we see that a vaccination in year 1 has ripple effects and lasts in year 5. So that's my example 1. So here's another one. And this has to do with having a sense of community and a sense of camaraderie with people like you. And this is the story of first-generation, working-class, low-income students who come into university interested in the life sciences. And so at US universities, there's a huge push to recruit more working-class students, but the likelihood of supporting these students through the college experience to graduation is hit or miss. It's sort of more checkered. So working-class students often are more likely to either switch out of STEM or to leave college without a college degree and high loans. So we wanted to test in this study whether having a residential program that was a living learning community would be a protective factor for these first-gen students in the life sciences. So again, we recruited students the summer before they came to university. If they were interested in the life sciences, we asked them to apply for this residential program. Among those who applied, we sort of quasi-randomly assigned some of them into the living learning program and some of them into the business as usual, so no different than controls. And you can see that the majority of these students were women, majority were BIPOC students, and they were all low-income first-generation college students. Many were Pell eligible, and that's why it was quasi. So what we tested is a bunch of stuff. I'm going to show you a few things. Oh, I forgot to mention this. So this is a package intervention. So there are multiple components that are in that living learning community that makes it different from the controls. There are ways in which we try to make it analogous, but we can't tease out the particular parts. So the kids in the living learning community took intro bio together as a cohort. They had a first-year seminar. They had a peer mentor. Their roommate was in the program, and they had sort of a semester. Every semester they had some sort of a social activity to create more camaraderie. Those in the control condition had the same bio class with the same professor, same syllabus, everything was the same, except they took it with other continuing generation students. They did have a first-year seminar, not in a cohort, no peer mentor, roommate not matched by major or first-gen status. They had lots of social activities, but not based on social class. What we found is that those students who were in that living learning community felt much significantly stronger sense of belonging in the life sciences than the control. They showed far less threat and anxiety about how they were doing in the life sciences, and their grade was significantly better. At the end of that first year, what we found is that threat reduction was the primary mechanism through which the living learning community predicted better grades. Not in this graph, but we followed these students into the end of their sophomore year when the program had ended, and we found that they were much more likely to be still in life science majors at that time. I won't present it because I don't have time. We then tried to create something like this in a virtual program, living learning, not the living part, but a learning community in engineering and computer science. I have slides at the back. We can come back to it if you're interested. All right, so here's my third example that has to do with meaning and purpose. So social motives guide our choices across the lifespan. It's not just about emerging adulthood. So these motives, like doing something that is personally meaningful and purposeful, is much more likely to drive the professional choices of people who are minoritized in any particular career, in this case STEM. So we wanted to test this hypothesis in the context of STEM entrepreneurship. So in case you don't know, entrepreneurship, STEM entrepreneurship in particular, is the actions that are involved in converting fundamental discoveries in the laboratory to inventions, commercial products, and services, much like the opening talk. And so what we were interested in is, do STEM entrepreneurship programs attract more women faculty, postdocs, and grad students if they amplify pro-social motives as compared to commercial or profit motives? So in the US, there is an NSF-funded mechanism called I-Corps. I-Corps is an entrepreneurship program that teaches faculty, grad students, and postdocs in STEM fields how to do that conversion of basic science into commercial products. So UMass had a site grant on which I was co-PI, and we used this opportunity to do an experiment. So we sent out emails to faculty, postdocs, and grad students, almost 10,000 of them across the university in STEM departments, inviting them to come and learn about this entrepreneurship training program. And we randomly assigned them to receive one of two versions of the email. One version that emphasized the social motives of entrepreneurship, the other version that emphasized the commercial motives of entrepreneurship. The content of the email was identical. The only difference was the subject line, the picture, and the stuff that you probably can't read, but in red. Everything else was the same. Then we waited to see who opened the email. What we found, the black bars, these are women faculty and grad students and postdocs was significantly more likely to open the email if it had a social framing than if it had a commercial framing. For male faculty and grad students in STEM, the framing didn't make a difference. They were equally likely to open the email. We had other metrics to sort of see if this was a one-off or not, but I'm just going to anchor on this. In a follow-up study, we went to the National I-Corps program, which is a national competition, and and all the PIs who apply for it and get awarded this I-Corps grant for their invention, then go to DC and get trained on it. If they get the grant, their abstracts are publicly available. So we downloaded more than 1,200 publicly available abstracts of people who had got these entrepreneurship grants, and we content coded them to see what the PIs had amplified in their invention. How much did they amplify social motives or the social good of their products and services, and how much did they amplify the profit or commercial motives? And then, of course, the coders were blind to condition, blind to the PI's sex, and they analyzed, content-coded the abstracts. So I want to show you one graph, which is this, that not surprisingly, women and men were equally likely to mention the commercial motives over the social motives. After all, this grant had to do with commercialization. But in addition, when we focus on the commercial motive, the social motives, we find that women PIs were more likely to mention social motives as well compared to their male colleagues. And we had other metrics like what they mentioned, what the invention was about, is it specific to the life sciences? And the answer is no. It was as true of technology and engineering as it was in the life sciences. So here are some takeaways. The local context that satisfy people's need to belong, to feel competent, and to pursue something that is socially meaningful is what attracts and retains people in STEM pursuits across the lifespan. Multiple interventions can do this. They can be peer mentoring, they can be affinity groups, they can be connecting one's career to social good. They all function as social vaccines. In our research, these benefits, we've sort of been really invested in longitudinal studies, and these benefits endure over long periods on multiple metrics, especially when inserted into transition points. Oh, I'm at 0. I just noticed it. Sorry, Andy. So the benefits are true across multiple groups. So more and more, my research is not so much just focused on gender. I'm particularly interested in social class and race. And also, I just want to say this, that the focus has been in the work we do is on fixing the situation, not trying to change construals or fix the person. None of this work would be possible without my collaborators, my students, former students and postdocs who are social psychologists, my biology colleagues, my economics colleagues with whom we are doing the entrepreneurship work, some colleagues at Harvard Kennedy School who are part of this other virtual program, and funding from the National Science Foundation. Thank you.
That might do it, actually. Here, let me. They should be able to. I'm not sure. I think he's trying. Yeah, I asked him if he's trying to do it right now. Otherwise, I can just pull up my laptop. But I think it might just not be. He made a change to this, though, actually. I think it might not. Can you just use your laptop or something? Yeah, I can. I think he'll be able to fix it, though. I think he'll be able to put it there. I just hope I can read it there. Yeah, just so that, because this is what's showing up, but can you just change it to the... Notes? Oh, then this is... Yeah, we don't need to do that. All we need to do is change this. So just go... Oh, because those are open. Oh. Okay, there we go. Okay.
All right, we're going to get back to it, guys.
Okay, last presentation of this session. So hi everyone. Is that really loud or we're good? I tend to project a lot, so. I'm Jen Steele, and I'm a faculty member at York University here in Toronto, and I'm really excited to be part of this fantastic lineup of speakers. For those of you who don't know me, the majority of my work really sits at the intersection of social and developmental psychology. And in much of my research, we've been examining the early development of bias in children, with more of a focus on racial bias and implicit social cognition more broadly. So through the consortium, as you saw, I've had the opportunity to be part of CLIMB and PRISM, two groups that really focus on how gender bias and STEM play out in childhood and into adolescence. But today I'm going to present some unpublished work that we've been conducting in my lab with adults that's been sort of an ongoing project that I've brought many different students onto across the years. So really examining associations between Asian women and STEM. Ooh, give me 1 second. Okay, so the research I'm going to present today, I just want to make sure that I stay on track. We'll see how we do. So the research I'm going to present today is inspired by a few different bodies of work. The first body of research is what we're all here to talk about today, which is that we know that women continue to be underrepresented in STEM fields, and this is particularly true in fields like engineering and computer science. And to date, both theory and research really suggest that gender stereotypes can create an ongoing barrier to women's progress in these fields by challenging their sense of belonging and fit, by contributing to a chilly climate and to discriminatory behaviors, and by changing the perceptions of women's potential and ability in these fields. Even when people are motivated not to gender stereotype, research suggests that gender stereotyping is found on implicit measures, including the Math Arts Implicit Association Test, or IAT, where both men and women are typically faster to pair math with men and arts with women relative to the reverse pairing. However, we also know that people have multiple aspects to their identities, sometimes with competing stereotypes. And we also know that stereotypes are not always applied equally to all members of a group. So research on person perception, as well as a growing body of research from an intersectional lens, has often acknowledged this and really tried to increase our understanding of how we make sense of the complexity of others' multiple identities, often with a focus on social categorization. So for example, when faced with an Asian woman and a white man, people might have gendered associations that pair him more easily with math versus arts. By contrast, they may hold racial stereotypes associating people who are Asian with STEM, leading an Asian woman to be more easily associated with math versus arts. Or as integration or additive models might suggest, people might attend to both identities, making it less certain what pattern of bias we might find. So the goal of this research was to better understand whether people would be more likely to show associations with Asian women and white men that reflected gender or racial stereotypes. To do this across the studies that I'm going to present today, we made use of an ambiguous categorization implicit association test, or IAT, that we've developed in my lab and we've been using in my lab. The typical IAT examines people's associations when targets are being categorized in one way, for example, by gender or by race. The ambiguous categorization IAT uses headers and stimuli that differ by two social or perceptual categories, allowing people to successfully complete the task, in this case by categorizing target faces by gender, race, or both. As in any math arts IAT, we're interested in people's reaction times in two critical blocks. So in one critical block of trials, white men and arts words share a response key, and Asian women and math words share the other key. And in the other critical block, white men and math words share one key, and Asian women and arts words share the other. As many of you would know, we take the reaction times from these two critical blocks and create a D-score that's an effect size estimate of people's associations. And as you can see, participants in this type of IAT can successfully complete this task by conceptualizing and subsequently categorizing both the white male and the female targets by the Asian female targets by gender, race, or both. And I'll just mention in this ACIHC, we add 3 trials to the end of the task. These include white women and Asian men that come up seamlessly at the end. So depending on how these are categorized, this allows us to examine whether participants seem to be attending more to gender or race. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about the results from these, but I'm happy to talk to any of you and answer any questions later. So in the 2 main studies that I'm going to present today, both pre-registered studies had a 2x2 design. Participants always completed an IAT. Both studies included a white men, Asian women condition to examine whether gender or racial stereotyping would emerge. And in each study, we also included comparison conditions to examine the prevalence of gender or racial stereotyping. So for example, in this first study, participants always saw men and women in their IATs, but the race of the targets differed. Participants were randomly assigned to one of 4 IAT conditions in this 2x2 design, and the images represent the race and gender of the target faces that people would categorize in their IATs using a cartoon header with the same race and gender. So in this study, the IAT was scored such that positive scores would indicate greater gender stereotyping, with participants being faster to pair men with math and women with arts relative to the reverse pairing. In the 2 conditions shown here, based on past research, we'd expect to find evidence of gender stereotyping. In both of these conditions, participants saw 2 targets of the same race, either Asian men and women or white men and women. In order to successfully complete the task, participants would need to attend to gender. What was more interesting to us was what we would find in the 2 conditions where targets differed simultaneously by both gender and race. And as noted earlier, we were especially interested in participants' associations when presented with Asian women and white men. If participants were primarily attending to gender across all conditions, we might expect a similar pattern of gender stereotyping across conditions. However, if participants were attending to race or both gender and race, we might expect less gender stereotyping when participants saw Asian women due to competing racial stereotypes. There are some other possibilities for what we might find, but I will stop there since this latter possibility is what we found in the data. So in this graph, IATD scores are on the y-axis. And as you can see in each condition, we see positive D scores, suggesting that regardless of the race of the target faces, participants are responding in a way that's consistent with gender stereotypes. However, what you might also notice is that this bias is attenuated slightly when participants saw Asian women shown on the left as opposed to white women shown on the right. So there was a significant main effect of female target race. This is interesting because it suggests that participants in these conditions were noticing women's race in these IATs, and that this may have led to less gender stereotyping of Asian women. However, what's important to note is that it isn't eliminating or even reversing gender dissociations. Gender stereotyping of Asian women is still very much coming through, even when the comparison is white men. So in study 2, we aim to replicate and extend these effects, and we did this with a very similar design. However, this time we always varied the race of the targets. So in study 2, participants were again randomly assigned to one of 4 IAT conditions. However, this time the targets always differed by race. Because of this, we scored the IAT in such a way that positive scores are now going to indicate racial stereotyping, with participants being relatively faster to pair Asian targets with math. In the 2 conditions shown here, we'd expect to find evidence of racial stereotyping. In both of these conditions, participants saw 2 targets of the same gender, either white and Asian women or white and Asian men. In the other 2 conditions, were identical to the 2 conditions from study 1, and we are interested whether our effects would replicate. In this design, we'd again expect a positive score when Asian men were paired with white women. Both race and gender stereotyping would lead participants in this condition to be faster at pairing Asian men with math. However, because higher scores now indicate racial stereotyping, we would actually expect a negative score for participants who saw Asian women paired with white men. This is because we anticipate that we'll see evidence of gender stereotyping for Asian women when participants can be categorizing these targets by gender, race, or both. And this is what we find. So again, on this IAT, higher scores indicate greater racial stereotyping. And there are two aspects of these findings that I want to highlight. First, as expected, we saw evidence of racial stereotyping in 3 of the 4 conditions. When Asian men were paired with white women or white men, or when Asian women were paired with white women, participants were relatively faster to pair Asian targets with math and white targets with arts. By contrast, participants were again relatively faster to pair white men with math when they also saw Asian women. That is, when paired with white men, Asian women were more likely to elicit gender-consistent stereotypes as opposed to race-related stereotypes on this ambiguous categorization IAT. We've run additional studies focused primarily on the comparison between Asian women and white men and have seen a similar pattern of results aligning with gender stereotyping. So, for example, we see a similar pattern among participants when we use word headers or cropped images that provide fewer gender cues. And we've also found similar effects when we examine just East and Southeast Asian participants in Canada, as well as Chinese participants in Singapore. We've also randomly assigned participants to categorize Asian women and white men either by gender or race on this measure. And again, we find that gender stereotyping seems to be very robust, whereas racial stereotyping, even under racial categorization conditions, is less prominent. If you want to learn more about this, please see Eric Allen from my lab sitting over there. He'll be presenting a poster on these data today. And I'll also mention that the research that I presented today really focuses largely on Asian women, but typically in the literature that term refers to East Asian and often Chinese. So in additional research, we've run similar studies with South Asian targets and have found similar effects. So this time with a science IAT, so a slightly different measure. This was part of Dr. Kristina Lepetskaya-Ady's dissertation work in my lab. And if you want to find out more, you can go to the poster session of Patricia Kalako and Kayla Robinson, new master's students who are thrilled I'm pointing them out over there in my lab who'll be presenting these findings. Okay, so what can we take from these findings? First, it would seem that in the context of math and arts, Asian women are spontaneously stereotyped as women and do not appear to derive much benefit from a positive racial stereotype in math, and I'll put positive in quotation marks, at least on this implicit measure and when compared to white or Asian men. It seems possible that this could be due, at least in part, to a racial stereotype that might be more frequently applied to Asian men and might only be applied to Asian women in the context of other women. This could also be due to the greater salience of gender in general, or the think STEM, think men stereotype. But taken together, I think these findings further emphasize the potential barriers that gender stereotypes in STEM can impose on all women, even those who might also seem to have a positive stereotype associated with other aspects of their identities, and the need for us to continue to find ways to overcome these barriers moving forward. So I want to say thank you to the many people and organizations that have made this research possible, and thank you to all of you for listening.
All the speakers should come up to the table, and you guys can grab seats here. So as a reminder, guys, so you can all grab seats, any seat you want. So there's individual microphones, so when I call out folks, you can just turn on your microphone by sliding the switch up. As a reminder, if you guys still want to submit questions on Slido, I'll have the iPad up here so I can look at those. You can vote on questions that amplify them so they can hopefully get asked with the time that we have. So just a reminder, if you guys still want to submit questions via Slido, you can do that. I have a device up here so I can keep tracking them. Make sure you identify who you're directing the question to by listing their name. And I think that's it. We're good. I know there's going to be a question we're going to ask to pull up some of your slides, Sapna, at the end. So, okay. So I'll try to go through questions with the most popular votes. It looks like the one that was most popular by a factor of 10 was, what is it like to collaborate with me, Jen? But I think we'll hold that to later if time permits. I first want to actually begin with a question that I think everyone can speak to. And then I'm going to go through ones that are targeted to individual speakers. So the first question that everyone I think could speak to is asking about what initiatives are in place to ensure all these insightful research efforts are shared with CEO leaders in STEM industries who have the power authority to implement organizational change to achieve gender inclusion. So why don't we, can I just call on someone to start? Yeah, okay, so I'll start with you, Buju, and then we can move it down from there.
I think that's a really important question. So what I've been trying to do is to spend more of my time than I did in an earlier part of my career interfacing with industry. So essentially, like giving talks, talking to people in industry rather than just academics. So I'm going less to academic conferences and more to both on the higher ed side and also to the industry and nonprofit and policy making side, because I think in order to get our lessons out, we need to talk to the people who make those programs and policies. And if we just stay in our lab, that's not going to happen. But it also isn't something that everybody wants to do, nor should they have to. And it also is probably a stage of career thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, in addition to echoing those things, I think for me, one of the things that has helped get the message out to people in industry is actually ESS. One of the arms of ESS really goes out into industry, and that's one of the ways that things have gotten out to industry, I'd say. And interestingly, I would say in the last 10 years, partly it's gotten out there because of my students, because I've had more students. It used to be like almost all my students ended up in academic jobs. Now it's about half. And half of them end up in industry, and that's another way that I think that it ends up getting out there. But I think we can do way better, and we need to be more thoughtful about it. Those are just ways that we're just beginning to think about it and take it seriously. How do we get our message beyond academia?
Why don't we keep, yeah, I'll maybe say something just really quickly and then I'll pass it over to you. With all of this, I do think within academia even, I think we can be doing better at sharing some of these results. I think at many schools, there are different interventions that get put into place, but I think we have a lot of knowledge that needs to be better translated, and I do applaud granting agencies for having those components in grants, but I think simultaneously, I think all of us have some level of responsibility to take. I was just even making notes just to remember to share a few papers with people who are on these types of committees at my institution, and I think it's really incumbent on all of us to really move forward with that and try to ensure that we're putting what we know into practice.
Yeah, I think also a very important question. So I guess I'll maybe be a little cynical since I'm last. So I've given many talks at many different companies and talked to some leadership, and I think one major challenge is legal departments. And so I don't know how to navigate that, but sometimes I feel like people don't want to know what's going on with bias, because then they're afraid that they could get sued, and so things are either kept very tight internal, and that that can have its own challenges, or they don't even want to figure out what's going on. So I think getting the information out there is super important, and I have seen, and I will end with a little bit of a non-cynical note. I have seen a lot of change happen, and actually one cool thing I just found out recently was that I gave a talk about masculine defaults at Apple, and I've given this talk at like many different companies, and as far as I know, nothing happens. But Apple actually took it on, and they have their Apple Care division. Actually, I don't even know how much. I'll just keep talking because they didn't tell me not to say this. But their Apple Care division, that's another whole issue, non-disclosure. But their Apple Care division has started measuring masculine defaults and having like a meeting, like a regular meeting where they talk about them. And so anyway, so I have seen change. I've seen like Google has made some changes, but I think the amount of change that I would like to see is not being made, and I think in part it's because of these legal challenges. So I think that's maybe something to work on.
Awesome, thank you guys. So for the next question, this is directed to you, Buju. If female mentors are so much more powerful, how do we deal with the tax on women mentors? Is it one more thing that women have to do, and does this have an impact on their performance or stress? And a related question that was also asked, this one by me, is whether you think male mentors are flawed by design, or if you think there's things that we could do to increase the positive impact that they could have on female students.
Yeah.
And those seem interconnected.
Yeah, they are interconnected. So I think a few different thoughts. One is there's a reason why we focused on peer mentors rather than faculty mentors, because there are many more women in engineering who are students and far fewer faculty. So that was sort of by design. I also think that it's less taxing because a lot of it is about professional and social networking. And this leads to the men question. I remember in the Nature Neuroscience paper, one of the reviewers asked about what's the mechanism through which this happens. And I think it's actually a networking mechanism that, although we don't have data, but that's my best guess. So I think that the women mentors are connecting their mentees to other students and faculty and TAs in a way that is helpful. And I think if male mentors who are very good mentors could make the same network connection, so that when the mentors graduate, their mentees have a strong foundation and a social network at the university. I think that's actually a key thing. I think as social psychologists, we are so used to thinking of changes in mindset, which are important, but I think more and more like a sociologist, that change in the social environment and who you know and who is going to help you when you stumble is really important. And my guess is that the female mentors are doing that work. So if we can train male mentors to do that, to connect the women mentees to Society of Women Engineers or to a TA or a faculty member whose lab they should work in, I think the male mentors could be very, very effective. So that's actually a study design that needs to be done. I haven't done it, but that's my guess.
Cool, that was great, thank you. So for Sapna, this is for you. A lot of interest in seeing the word clouds, especially with intersectional gender roles, and wondering if you could possibly call those up. I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I thought you'd never ask. No, just kidding.
Okay.
I told you to ask.
A related question, which is, how do you recommend interrupting leaders that seem comfortable focusing on gender diversity, but not confronting whiteness or racial homogeneity? And I can help set that up.
Oh, you want me to answer that second question?
No, I can think about it in the context of
okay. Yeah, okay, so let me start by saying that I'm going to show you these word clouds. These are pilot data. So you're welcome to, we're going to engage with them, but they're up here, but they're not up there. Okay, anyway, that's okay. But we're rerunning these. So this is data from Prolific, and I think it's like 50 people per different groups. I'll tell you how we collected these data as I'm showing them to you. But we're rerunning it now on a nationally representative sample. So I see that there's already phones out taking pictures. I'm happy for you to take pictures. Just don't post it because these are going to change as we collect nationally representative data. But what we did is we asked people in the 4 largest racial and ethnic groups in the US, so these 4 groups, to tell us what expectations they have for the women in their racial group and what expectations they have for the men in their racial group. So these are people reporting on their own racial groups, reporting expectations for the women and men. And what you can see is they're very interesting. So on the upper left up there is Latinx people talking about the expectations they have for women in their group. And you can see words like good cook come up very prominently. This is black people talking about the expectations they have for black women. So I'm only showing you the women ones right now, black women, and you can see the word strong comes up as most prominent. And then we have white people talking about the expectations that they have for white women. And here you see a lot of the words that show up in the literature, like polite and caring. And then we have Asian people doing the expectations for Asian women, and you see smart show up, submissive. And I think what's so interesting about this, I mean, there's many things, but what's so interesting is words like strong and smart, those are typically associated with the male gender role, but they're showing up here as some of the strongest words associated with women of color. And anyway, I have a lot more to say about that. I don't have the men's ones on these slides, but what I can say about that is the reason I don't have them is because actually they're not as interesting. So they actually look a lot more similar across, I mean, there are differences, but I think that alone is interesting too, because it might show that the male gender role is more constrained, like strong comes up a lot for all of
the bend. And anyway, so that's one thing. We have tested this, and the white women gender role is the most similar to what's in the literature. If you just give people the list of words, on the other three are equally far away from what's in the literature right now. So there's that. And then we have some other studies, but I feel like I'll start talking for way too long, so I'll end it there, and I'm happy to answer other questions about this too. And like I said, we're doing nationally representative data now, so don't expect, I think it's going to look, maybe somewhat similar, but also quite different. So, and then should I answer that second question?
Yeah, if you want to sit
Okay.
down, I can.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yes, can you repeat it? I remember thinking it was a hard
Sure.
question.
It's how do you recommend interrupting leaders that seem comfortable focusing on gender diversity but not confronting whiteness or racial homogeneity?
Okay. Yes, I agree. I agree that this is a real issue. I think there's a lot of people, like white people, who are very comfortable, not very, but more comfortable with interrupting gender, talking about gender than they are talking about race. I guess what I do, or what I believe, is that you don't have to, I guess you should just do it and not worry so much about how they're responding. Of course you have to worry about how they're responding because there can be consequences, but you just have to be prepared for those consequences. I guess that's the best I can say. So I think it is difficult, but I think it shouldn't stop you from trying to do something about it. And there's education, and I think that education can help. And some of the default language, I think, can help, because I think sometimes whiteness is so embedded into our society that it's hard for white people to sometimes even realize that something is about whiteness, and that's where there's a lot of defensiveness. So I think maybe education around what whiteness looks like. I mean, I think people are just a lot more familiar with talking about masculinity and femininity than they are with talking about whiteness, and so some education around that to start, and then having just calling it out and just being prepared for worse consequences. I guess that's where I'll end it, which is maybe another cynical, depressing way to think about it. But I'm happy to hear from others too, who I'm sure have experience with this. But yeah, very important question.
Thank you. I'll probably have a follow-up to that after we go through a few more questions. But with Steve, one key question for you is, what's next in the social identity threat measures, and how can organizations begin to apply them and use them to inform intervention planning?
Well, I think what I tried to talk about today, and I think what really is next, is thinking about, if you were thinking about an organization, where are the contexts within that organization where you're going to experience most social identity threat? And we've thought about this a lot in academia. We're there. We know that there's some contexts where some groups at least feel relatively safe and they're valued and they belong, and other contexts where they don't. I also tried to hint, though, that other types of interventions that's been used, knowing what people's threats are, you can predict which ones are going to work and which ones aren't, and when they're going to work and when they're not. And I am a big proponent, and I've really admired Buju's work for a long time, about talking about how you change the environments rather than provide interventions to provide people different ways to think about it. So if you understand what are the barriers to people feeling like they belong, those are things you can begin to address in specific environments. And so that's what I was trying to get across today. I'm not sure how well I did, but I think that that's really what, where the social identity threat perspective can go forward. And we were really handicapped when we had to find performance deficits to think about that, because lots of time people have social identity threat and they overcome it just fine, and you don't have performance deficits. But that doesn't mean that that isn't a really difficult environment, and it doesn't mean it won't come out in other ways, like whether people stay, whether you have retention, whether they find value in the work. All of those things, are connected to this larger feeling of social identity threat. And performance is one important and consequential outcome, but there are lots of other important and consequential outcomes as well.
Cool. So related to this has there been any work looking at how typically privileged groups, such as men, might experience social identity threat in specific environments, like gender nonconforming men in hypermasculine spaces?
We have a whole bunch of different contexts, and I'll point to one study that I think really makes this clear. Katie surveyed everybody in intro psych at Indiana University, and 90% of them, with just 6 different social identities, had social identity threat in at least one of the 6. So yeah, lots of people experience social identity threat in lots of different contexts. I think gender nonconforming men in very masculine environments, I would bet that's the case. I don't think we've looked at that specific one. We have looked at transgendered people in different spaces, and that's one of our biggest effects ever. And so, yeah, I mean, I would expect strong social identity threat. I think that particular one we haven't done. But you can look at all different kinds of groups and try and contextualize where they feel threat and what that threat looks like.
Okay. So I actually want to go back to Sapna with the earlier conversation that we were having, and also maybe try to loop in Jen on this too as a developmental psychologist. Like myself, when I hear about the idea of adult, white people are resistant to accepting sort of whiteness, and you could imagine that the resistance could be because they might perceive it as a threat to self, or maybe it's because it's something they've benefited from, lived through for so many years. It begs the question of whether you think it might be easier to achieve some of these desired changes and how people think about this if we were to work with younger populations. And I'm just curious whether you think that if you were to target younger kids to teach about sort of these embedded sort of cultural defaults, whether you think that might be more effective than potentially trying to work with adults where there might be other factors at play.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say yes, and I think I live in Seattle, and I think that what I've seen in the education system is that that's one of the goals actually, is to try to get kids, all kids, but I think probably especially white kids, very comfortable with thinking about identities, talking about identities, realizing that everybody has an identity and they have certain positions. And so what I see of the younger generation is they do have a lot more comfort, have more of an idea of privilege, things like that. And so I hope that does go some way into reducing resistance, and defensiveness to making change. I don't know if anybody's studied that though. I'm sure somebody has. So I hope maybe you might know whether those kind of early education efforts end up paying off later into either making change or being less defensive. But yeah, I'll pass it over.
Yeah, thanks. So first off, I think Andy just threw this my way so that I could say Andy is an amazing collaborator. I'm just going to put that out there. And in all honesty, I really have enjoyed, just having the opportunity to work together. So I just wanted to put that out there for everyone. With respect to this, I think a number of people, I agree with you with respect to what's happening in the schools. I think there's a lot that's going on that certainly does not feel reminiscent of discussions that were necessarily going on when I was a child, that I see, even with my own children. And I think developmentally, we sort of need to continue to contemplate when is the appropriate time for some of these interventions. I think there are subtle ways and not so subtle ways that these things get addressed. I think there are a lot of people increasingly looking at the parents' roles and how parents can talk about some of these things, and including, I know, Trish is involved with some of this work, so and maybe others in the room as well. So I think that's really important work to just sort of figure out how parents can play a role potentially, but I think parents also have to face their own biases in talking about these things to children. So I think some parents are probably better positioned than others. But I think teachers are in a great position too. Again, I think some teachers as opposed to others. And so I think this is always the challenge with respect to, I know there's a high school course in the Toronto District School Board now that's largely focused on deconstructing anti-Black racism, and we're doing some research looking at the impact of this. But again, I think they've had a hard time finding teachers to teach the course, and so I think that's a key component, as well as finding the right people to have these conversations with kids.
Thank you.
And, we should also say that we're talking about Seattle and Toronto, but there's so many places like in the U.S., that where a lot of these efforts are being rolled back, and that has possible major implications for what happens, in the future when these students become leaders in their organizations or whatever. So, yeah, more work needs to be done on that.
So Jen, there's a question about your work and really trying to understand about how you think the race and gender would intersect if you were looking at Black and Indigenous populations, and whether there's any efforts for intervention works to try to change the biases that people have.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've used this type of measure. I mean, again, these are sort of looking at those spontaneously activated associations and also social categorization processes. So the intersection piece, I don't know if I've got a great answer to that. And most of my work hasn't focused too much on intervention. So I'm not sure I have a great answer to that, to be totally honest. There might be other people on the panel, actually, who might be in a better position to address kind of the intervention piece to it. I do think many people have, in this room included, have conducted research just sort of looking at how the social context can highlight different aspects of people's identity. So I think that's a key component to it for sure. How we intervene on that and what the implications are, I don't know if other people have thoughts on that.
I actually wonder if you could take some of these representation or peer mentoring interventions and put them in a school setting with young kids, and then test whether exposure to a high school kid who is good at math, who is Black or Indigenous, compared to another kid will have an impact on the like the observer's implicit attitudes. But I should also say, more and more, I think that sometimes you don't see an effect on one measure. This reminds me of Steve, your performance idea, but you'll see it on other things. So I often see the effect of these interventions on self-efficacy and on belonging, even if I don't see it on an IAT. So I would say if you do this thing, include other sorts of measures like belonging and self-efficacy. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to pull off 2 questions, one to Buju, then one to the whole panel. So just keep that in mind when you answer this next one, Buju. But so the crux of the question is essentially looking at whether you think small doses of these kinds of inoculations, as you're putting it, could be still effective, and whether you think that there's any parallel benefits if all 4 factors that you identified for members of dominant groups could be useful if there's some inoculation that would boost allyship. Yeah, so the specific question around small doses, and this came from Sapna, was asking about whether, if you think, can getting some exposure help inoculate some women against negative consequences of future discrimination? And so that was one question. Then I was trying to tie in another one about whether you think in this model things could be done to boost allyship among men.
Yeah, so I think the small doses is right. I don't think we need a big dose. So one of the things I didn't say is that in the peer mentoring study, even though we wanted mentor-mentees to meet once a month, they actually only met twice in the fall semester, twice in the spring. So 4 one-hour meetings had this profound effect. So I think small doses are particularly effective in transition periods. If I had to guess, I would say they were so effective because it was in that first year of college. And maybe if those students had been juniors, it would have been less effective. So I do think small doses are very effective, and the timing might be the key variable that determines the magnitude of the impact. Just like kids get vaccinated when they're kids, so think of it in that way. What the second one was allyship. So what can these 3 things, can these 3 motives help allyship? Is that the question?
Yeah, so the specific question was asking about whether you can effectively, thinking about these motives, are there things that you can do to basically inoculate men to boost allyship?
Right. So I see men scientists who are particularly good at attracting women and students of color in their labs as people who, one, sort of connect their research or the lab's research to something related to social good. I see them as paying a lot of attention to belonging among students in their lab. And I think that's when, no matter what the PI's identity is, that the people in their lab are far more likely to thrive. And I think the key is fostering belonging and connecting the lab's work to something related that's personally meaningful to the students.
Okay, thanks. So just in the interest of time, I think what I'll do is just ask you guys each just to give if you had to deliver one message to scientists, to organizations, what would you want that key take-home message to be? And we can just go down the line, but starting maybe with Sapna, since you were just talking Bijou.
Oh boy. This is a hard question. It's a hard last question. Maybe I'll just go back to trying to partner, so academic, industry partnerships, because I think that there's still a lot that we as academics need to figure out and we could learn, and then people in industry have so much knowledge about what's happening on the ground day to day. My first original line of work that I talked about, the stereotypical environments, I got inspired because I actually interviewed at different tech companies, and it was based on my own experience of interviewing and going into a tech company that looked just like what my studies end up looking like. And so a lot of my research is inspired by what was happening at the time in industry, and so having that kind of regular back and forth between industry and academia, I think is so important because there's so much more to discover, and things are changing all the time, so we need to be attending to those changes. So I'll just leave it there.
I won't say much about this. I will say just for industry partners to be aware that they're, and in academia, for us to just continue to have some level of awareness of biases, because I think there are certainly people who continue to kind of think this is outdated or not needed anymore, or maybe even discussions around diversity are overdone, and just making sure that we continue to be able to present data to suggest that's not the case.
I'll try and keep it short. I guess I would try to say that context really matters, and you have to care about context and create context where people can thrive and use all the things that we've talked about to create those contexts.
I would say partnerships, echoing what Sapna you said. And the second thing I would say is that sometimes less is more. Interventions that are more subtle without hitting people over the head may be really effective. And I think intergroup contact is one example of why that's so effective. Sometimes you don't need to, if you hit people over the head, it backfires. Or the states ban it, one or the other.
Andy, I thought of a better one. Can I say one more?
Yep, sure.
I hate going first. Sometimes when I'm frustrated, I'm like, things are not happening up there. So this is maybe relevant to everybody. I always think about, what can I control? Like, what change can I make in among my own group or my own whatever, and that just always makes me feel better, because if we all create a space that is welcoming and equitable, and everybody does that, then we've solved the problem. So I'll leave it at that. So, sometimes it's hard to think really big. Of course, it's important to do that, and we need to do that as much as we can. But when that feels hard, then thinking small, I think, can be helpful. So a little bit like Bijou's message.
Awesome, thank you. So please join me in thanking the speakers for this first session. Awesome, and thank you guys for submitting great questions. I'll pass it over to Toni.
Yeah, I just want to say we got started 10 minutes late, so that's why we kind of went a little bit past. But we'll be back in about 12 minutes, so 25 past the hour. So we'll be back for the next panel. Thanks.
We're going to get back together and start and try to keep on time. The first thing I want to say is I think Andy set a ridiculous bar for moderator, and I will lower that significantly, and won't be able to be quite as organized or together as Andy was, and probably not bring the questions together nearly as much. Make it easier for the rest of the people. This symposium, we're looking at international perspectives, and we have a very distinguished panel. Here we have Dr. Takako Hashimoto. She's actually the vice president of Chiba University of Commerce. I think she has a unique position in this space in that she's an engineer and yet does groundbreaking social science research too. And she brings new methods and new approaches, and she's going to tell us a lot about the STEM space within in Japan. Then we have Glenn Adams from University of Kansas. Andy mentioned that Buju had a similar lineage. Glenn and I have a similar lineage as well, and I've admired Glenn's work for a long time. He also worked with my advisor, Claude Steele, when he was a graduate student. And Glenn has done, I think, some of the most groundbreaking work on culture, and particularly how it relates to different international perspectives. I admired his work, and it's absolutely fantastic. And last but certainly not least is ESS's leader, Toni Schmader. Toni, for those of us in ESS, know that none of this would happen without her. And not only that, she has been the best leader that I've ever worked with. And she's a brilliant social scientist as well. Recently won the Theoretical Innovation Prize at SPSP. So we'll have Toni as the last in our group today. And I'll welcome up Takako is going to give the first talk.
Okay, hello everyone. Yeah, I'm Takako Hashimoto, Vice President of Chiba University of Commerce, Japan, and Research Fellow of the University of Tokyo. Thank you so much for giving me this great opportunity to share the STEM situation in Japan with all of you. Okay, let me start with a brief introduction of myself. So, and actually, as I was an industry engineer for long years. After graduation, I worked for the RICO, one of the major industry engineering company in Japan. And while working for the industry, I got my PhD in engineering, and I changed my career to be the faculty of university in Japan. And I have some positions in government and other public institute like this, and working for the female engineer support as well. And also, I am a volunteer leader of the IEEE. Hopefully you know IEEE is the largest technical society, academic society all over the world. And I am currently the IEEE Region 10, that means Asia Pacific region, director-elect 2023-24, and I will become the IEEE Region 10 director in 2025. So actually, the IEEE has more than 400,000 members all over the world. And in Asia Pacific, we have around 170,000 members in Asia Pacific countries. So it's quite big. And I visit different countries, such as India, Malaysia, and China, and so on. So, and to see the situation of the female STEM education, and so on. So, and this is the agenda in IEEE. So again, we have IEEE have more than 400,000 members all over the world. And the list the left graph is a female ratio. So in the world, now in total, so for all the members in IEEE, so female member ratio is almost 14%, and we have unknown members, just sexual. They do not want to provide their sexuality, and but mainly, basically, we have 14% female members. And the Asia Pacific, so we have almost 20% members are female. So there, maybe India and other developing countries are really eager to be their engineers. So many female students want to be engineers, study computer science, and we have the good number of female ratio, so 20% around. However, Japan, so we just have less than 4%, very, very few. So, and this is a problem in Japan. We realize we need to have more female engineers, even in IEEE, but less than 4%. And for your interest, so in the US, the female is almost 9%. This is also not a good number, I think, compared to the average of the world in IEEE. And this is the general situation, Japan gender gap index. So gender gap index, Japan ranked 25th, so out of the 146 countries. So, and we are quite bad country regarding the gender gap. And actually the politics and the economies evaluation are very bad. And also we have some issues in education and health as well. So therefore today I would like to talk about the Japan situation on STEM from the perspective of the education and family and also profession. So let me start with the education, STEM education in Japan. So this is the ratio of women graduate in STEM field. So actually this is the OECD for the OECD countries, and OECD average is 32%. So among the students in a STEM department, so OECD average, the 32% of students are female, but Japan just 16%, the actually lowest ratio in OECD countries. So this is a very bad situation we realize, but actually this is the ratio of female students in Japanese universities and graduate schools. So, and different department, different measure. So humanities and social science, engineering, agriculture, medicine, dentistry, pharmacy and nursing, education, other, and so on. And you can see in a science and engineering department, the female student ratio is very low compared to other disciplines. So especially in engineering department, so just 15.7% undergraduate students are female. So the ratio is quite low, and actually the problem, the very serious problem is the less female students. There are less female students who select the engineering or STEM department like this. And this is so therefore why the female students do not select the STEM department, STEM career. So we think the reason is one of the main reasons is the education in junior high school or high school. So, and this is the teacher's gender ratio by subject. So Japanese, social studies, mathematics, science, music, art, health, home studies, and English. And the yellow bar shows the female ratio, and green bar shows male ratio. And you can see the math and science related to STEM. So the majority teachers are male, and very few female teachers in math and science subject. So there are very, very few female teachers in a STEM subject at junior high schools. This is one of the reasons the female students do not choose the STEM career, actually, in their junior high school and high school days. And actually, there's a survey result, the teacher's gender influence on girls' STEM career choice. So there are two bars. The upper bar shows the male teachers teaching the STEM subject to the female student. And below the bar, so that shows the female teachers for any of STEM subject teach their STEM to the female student. And the female student, so likely to go to select the STEM type career choice, STEM type career. So more than taught by the female teachers, more than they're taught by the male teachers. So if there's at least one female teacher in STEM subject, girls tend to choose STEM career path. So this is also very important influence in our education for the STEM. So therefore, we need to increase our STEM female teachers in STEM subject. But I showed so there are very less female students in university. So therefore, it's very difficult to increase the teachers, female teachers in STEM subject. But anyway, so if we have more female teachers in STEM subject, we can have the female girls. We can have girls who choose the STEM career. Okay. And also, the family problem is very serious, So Japan is a quite traditional country. So the engineering and mathematics do not the girl's mother. This is a very traditional mindset in our society. And there's one survey or research, so analyzing the mother's educational background influence. So this research says that mothers with STEM background are more likely to have postgraduate degrees and have a higher degree of specialization. So this means mothers with STEM background or have the higher education degree. So this is also the kind of the tendency in Japan. And mothers with STEM background are more likely to want their children to go into STEM than humanities mothers. So mothers with STEM background, so they know the value of STEM career choice. So it is also very important findings from this research. And children of mothers with STEM background are more likely to go on to STEM degrees. So therefore, if we can have the mothers with STEM background more, so we can have the more girl students who choose the STEM career. But so therefore, we need to increase the mothers with STEM background. But not easy, actually. And also, this is the data to show the mother's influence on the girls' STEM career paths. The left bar shows the mothers with STEM background, the female girl student, so which department they choose for their career for their university department. And this left bar shows mother with STEM background, and right bar shows mother with humanity background. And according to the research result, we could find that children of mothers with STEM background study STEM. And mothers with STEM backgrounds want their children to go into STEM field. They are actually regardless gender, but especially for girls students. So it is very important to have their mother with STEM background. It is their finding from the research of the mother's influence for their girls' STEM career choice. And then I would like to share some data of the STEM profession in Japan. So, and according to the, ratio in a university female student ratio, so in a STEM, so of course, we have low ratio of female researchers in STEM, like this. So we just have the 15.7% female researchers in STEM fields. It is also lowest ratio in these countries. And actually, they're in professions, industries. So ratio of females and IT engineers. So actually, in a total, the older business sectors, so we have the 46% of workers, employees are female. Around the 50% of workers are female. But for the IT engineers, less than 20%. So we can not see the female IT engineers in IT companies as well. So very difficult to find the female engineers in IT industries. So this is also a very serious problem. So the university students, quite less university students in engineering STEM field, affects of course, and the employees in IT sectors. So of course, we need kind of the barrier for being promoted. So, and not only engineering, STEM industry, but also the other business sectors. So we have a glass ceiling, the promotion to the decision makers, ICT, and other business sectors. The female manager ratio is less than 10%, most of the business sectors. It is also a very serious problem, and we need to improve. Okay, finally, I'd like to introduce our Women's Digital Talent Development Plan led by Japanese government. So this is a kind of the government plan, so led by the cabinet office by the Japanese government. So government is leading the initiative to promote women's independence after COVID-19 pandemic. And so by developing digital talent in women. And even the COVID-19 pandemic, IT sector is increasing employment in Japan, even in Japan. So the women participation urgently needed in IT sectors. So, and this is one of the data provided by the Japanese government. It is very effective for the kind of the female mothers and teachers to promote the STEM. And this data shows the different business sector, the system consultant, software developer, other ICT engineer. These are related to STEM work, and accounting clerk and food beverage service workers, non-STEM work. So, and regarding the STEM work, the annual salary increases directly with experience of women working in STEM. So this is a very effective data, and mothers and teachers can realize the STEM is a really good work for the young generations. They can have the good salary and increasing according to their experience. So, and almost conclusion. So, therefore, according to these data, what should we do to solve the situation? So we are now thinking. And we have to, anyway, change the traditional mindset. The female students are not good at the STEM subjects. We still have this traditional old mindset we need to change. And to change this mindset, we have to raise awareness of STEM field among parents and teachers, and show role models in STEM fields to inspire students to aspire, and realize the curriculum that shows female students how interesting the science and STEM subject can be. And also we need to prove that engineering is a profitable career. So this is a very important point. So engineering, a profitable career is very important, and we need to promote this point in even in university students. And also another point is actually Japan is a quite limited society and low diverse society. So therefore we have to retain the within Japan. We have to kind of we have to show the female student or the world. Yeah, it's crucial to venture out early and gain global insight for female students and seek out worldwide role model and mentors. Okay, thank you so much. This is my presentation. Yeah, thank you so much.
Glenn? Oh, there. Thought you were sitting over there before. So we'll hand it off to Glenn Adams from University of Kansas.
Thanks. Okay, we got competing microphones here, but I guess I'll do this. First of all, thanks for that very interesting first presentation. And I think I'll be saying some things that resonate and maybe some things that call for a kind of broader discussion. So I think that'll be interesting. But thanks to the organizers for inviting me to come and represent the work that I've been doing with my collaborator, Noor Solyu, who, on the topic of gender gaps in STEM participation from a cultural psychological perspective. Unfortunately, Noor is not here today, so you have me to tell you about the work. But it's really, I want to stress that she's the authority and it is her work on this. Luckily, related to that, what I'm going to present today is in many ways a summary and an idiosyncratic elaboration of a paper that Noor and I have published on the topic. So I encourage you to consult that paper for the authoritative account that more faithfully presents Noor's understanding of the topic. I'm going to start from the baseline social psychological model of the gender gap in STEM that's evident in the title of this meeting itself, Breaking Barriers. And this account suggests that the gender gap in STEM exists because societal barriers obstruct or impede women's participation. And this account this is based on a large body of work that many people in the room have done, and including myself, providing evidence for that account. The focus of our work is on a couple complications of this basic model. First, as an account of difference, this model has the issue of focusing on the more marginalized of the side of the difference. So it explains women's underrepresentation or under participation, but it doesn't explain why men are choosing to do what they do. And the problem with that is that it can kind of naturalize men's preferences as if it's a phenomenon that doesn't require explanation. And so that's one thing that we like to think about. And then the other thing, is that we want to consider sociocultural variation in the extent of the gender gap in STEM. And this is partly interesting and important because to the extent that the gender gap does have sociocultural sources, then it suggests that the extent to which the phenomenon is not a product of biologically essentialist sex difference, abstracted from social context, but instead is a social, cultural, and historical product. The most straightforward hypothesis about gender, or about social cultural variation, is what we'll refer to as the freedom hypothesis. And it basically says that if the gender gap is the product of societal barriers, then the gender gap should be smaller in more gender egalitarian societies that work to remove the barriers in service of women's self-determination. So Noor reviewed studies that examined the sociocultural variation in the gender gap in 3 categories of STEM outcomes. Table 1 from the paper provides an overview of evidence for the freedom hypothesis with the outcome of STEM performance. So in a very sophisticated meta-analytic technique here, I've color-coded the evidence for the freedom hypothesis in green. So for example, an early study considered women's rates of participation in, what does it say? Oh, see, I can't even read it. In higher education, labor force, and industrial workplaces, and observed that these measures of gender egalitarianism were related to smaller gender gap in STEM performance. So that's evidence for the freedom hypothesis. I've color-coded in red evidence against the freedom hypothesis. So for example, a couple studies that use GDP or the gender gap index, which Dr. Hashimoto had just referred to, found that in fact and I should say that the gender gap is a measure of societal level gender parity in economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. And this research suggested that higher GDP and greater societal gender parity was associated with a larger gender gap in STEM. Performance, in particular. So I've color-coded as ambiguous evidence for the freedom hypothesis in yellow, and I don't know, if you look at it, I'd say you subject it to the eyeball test, and let's call it mixed evidence for the freedom hypothesis. Table 2 from the paper provides an overview of evidence for the freedom hypothesis for the outcome of STEM beliefs and attitudes. And by attitudes, beliefs and attitudes here, we're talking about things like math self-concept and self-efficacy, liking and enjoyment of STEM domains, and STEM-related aspirations. And here, I think the evidence starts to tip a little bit in favor of evidence against the freedom hypothesis. That is, greater indicators of societal gender equality are related to a higher gender gap in these kind of STEM beliefs and attitudes. And finally, table 3 comes from a paper, or from the paper provides an overview of evidence for the freedom hypothesis with respect to the outcome of STEM participation. And here, there's only one study that reported evidence consistent with the freedom hypothesis. And the rest of the studies reported evidence that was either inconclusive or it found the opposite pattern, that the gender gap in STEM was particularly higher in nations with higher GDP or indicators of societal gender equality. We also conducted an analysis on our own that speaks to the manifestation or a way of understanding the difference that we were wanting to investigate, which is she coded countries according to whether you could call them weird, Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. And so essentially she was coding Western European countries and the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. And coding for that, looking at the gender gap in STEM participation using data from UNESCO about a bunch of different fields. And the percentage of degrees to women in these various fields, you can see that for higher education and social sciences overall, there's a positive relationship between weirdness and women's participation. So that seems to be associated, weirdness equals greater women's participation, but not in computer science, where weirdness is associated with lower women's participation. There's no relationship for the fields of physics, math, and engineering, but that gives you a sense for the idea that the freedom hypothesis or the looking at variation across settings is not necessarily straightforward. Okay, so a bit more about the model that we're looking at the data through, or the issue through. So I think this is a fair statement of the social psychological model. You have stereotypes that exist in society, and through patterns of socialization in these worlds that are structured with these stereotypes, people pick up different senses of who they are, different kinds of identifications, different kinds of motivations, different experiences of threat, different experiences of anxiety, and then that leads them to choose or not choose STEM fields. And we're interested in our work to consider the sociocultural and historical context that underlies or even constitutes this supposedly just natural kind of dynamic. In particular, we consider variation in the construction and experience of self in the social world along a dimension that I talk about as a kind of modern individualist abstraction from context on the right, where kind of a high entropy sort of system where people imagine themselves as independent actors, and they imagine society as something that they kind of agree or not to get together. This kind of understanding of reality suggests to people that what constitutes a person is really the internal things that make them different, and that those are the source of action, and that is sort of where you go to look for things that drive you and that move you, that count about what's really real. And you'll recognize that as a kind of the liberal democratic model, the kind of liberal social philosophy that emerged in the Enlightenment, and a number of different other sources. But you can contrast that on a kind of dimension, not in a sort of dichotomous fashion, but in a dimension with kinds of realities where people understand that those realities promote the experience of being embedded in some kind of network, and where one understands oneself as being tugged on by different social ties, regardless of what you feel about those ties, whether you like them or not. It's just a more relational ontology, a relational understanding of the person. And that has implications for a lot of different things, as a lot of people have written about, but we're going to talk about it, how it might matter for this model that I showed you of stereotypes and their impact on gender exclusion in STEM. So one first way that it works is in this path from stereotypes to attitudes. And this is, for my purposes today, a little bit less interesting but equally important. And this work, the sort of one that jumps to mind immediately, is work by Serge Guimond and colleagues, looking at how people understand who they are, what kind of social comparison tendencies do they engage in as a function of these different sort of understandings of society. That modern individualist, often associated with weird spaces, understanding of self and society encourages the idea that social identities don't matter and who counts as a relevant comparison target. So you can compare yourself to everybody. By contrast, if you understand yourself in terms of embedded social locations, then category differences matter, and you tend not to compare yourself across category boundaries. You tend to compare yourself within category boundaries. So if you work on reference group effects and shifting standards model and things like this, you'll know that when you compare, in the present context, if a woman is comparing herself in the former model, the comparison would be to men and women, and might come up with a different sense of where she sits with respect to abilities or interests than if a person, a woman in this case, is comparing herself within a category of other women, in which case she might imagine that she was more interested or had more ability. So that's one way that STEM attitudes may differ in different settings as a function of this model of self and social relations. But the other implication is for the construction of choice. And in particular, a dimension of variation between whether you see choice as a self-expression or you see academic choice in particular as something that's oriented toward material and security concerns. So, a model here, the idea of, is that cultural ecologies of modern individualist abstraction from context promote a construction of academic choice as self-expressive. You're supposed to do things that reflect what you think is really true about you, and you find motivating the opportunity to elaborate those aspects of self that you think are important. So a couple primary goals here are affirming identities in general, but gender identities in particular, which becomes especially important. Here some of the work looks at romantic identities, for example. So how it is that people who, when romantic motivations are salient, this is one manifestation of a gender identity for both men and women, the model suggests, that leads them to engage in activities that are more gender stereotypical, performing these particular kinds of identities. And so that kind of goal where not only your academic choices, but your mating choices are things that you're supposed to choose as opposed to do not necessarily based on the preferences, choose based on preferences in this model of cultural ecologies of modern individualistic abstraction, but in other cultural ecologies not so much thought of or experienced as a personal choice, that when you understand it as a personal choice, they become something where your preferences become relevant. And if you have gender preferences, those express themselves in bigger gender gaps in STEM. Other kinds of motivations for academic choice might just be material security or fulfilling relational expectations. And in the model, I went by it pretty quickly, but you might notice that there's a direct path from this idea of different constructions of academic choice and STEM choice, such that anybody who is considering these more security-oriented goals has a security orientation. Anytime a security orientation is operating, it might induce people to choose STEM more than another field. But there's also a moderating path, such that the same process will exacerbate any existing gender differences in self-concept, say, or those preferences that people might have that are gendered. So it leads people in general, we propose, to seek the materiality or security orientation can lead people to seek gender choices, or sorry, STEM choices, but also moderates the gender gap in attitudes. Okay. One study that we've conducted, I'll just share it to give you a sense for how this plays out. In one experiment, we had university students at the University of Kansas. I'll just go over it quickly. You can see the characteristics of the participants. The basic design was that we randomly assigned participants into 3 different conditions. In one condition, participants read a brief passage emphasizing the importance of personal fulfillment, following one's heart, following one's passions, to describe, or to use a phrase that other people have used, Sapna and her collaborators, expressing one's own desires when choosing an academic pursuit. And in the security orientation condition, participants read a brief passage emphasizing the importance of economic security and financial stability in the choice of academic pursuit. And in a control condition, participants just read a prompt that mentioned the need to take into consideration various factors in choosing an academic pursuit without discussing what those were. And then we just had a very simple dependent variable. People responded on a 7-point scale. How interested are you in pursuing math and STEM, math and science-related fields after college? And how motivated are you to pursue math and science-related careers after college? And first of all, controlling showing you results for comparing the participants in the control condition and the self-expression condition. Men's responses, or the male participants, are on the left in each of these, and the women or female participants on the right. The colors didn't exactly show up the way I wanted them to. And the thing that I want to show is that in this particular case, the manipulation impacted the self-expression manipulation impacted the responses of women such that they expressed less STEM interest and motivation than they did in the control. It did not have an effect on the men's interest and motivation, but the security condition in this particular case didn't impact the women's motivation and interest, didn't increase it, but it did increase the men's. So, and yeah, interestingly, as I mentioned before, but especially when you compare it to the security condition, this idea that maybe, well, let me go to an implication, yeah, first implication. So now, to conclude this, I'm going to wrap up by pointing to a few different things I think are provocative about the perspective and the results. First of all, about this notion of challenging the androcentric standard, or challenging the kind of presumed male default, if you will, of some of the research, even. This perspective suggests that male experience is not just natural, but also requires explanation. In particular, this idea that if we're thinking about the choices that people make in terms of their sort of driving motivations or driving preferences or interests, you might say, okay, increasing, if the gender gap is a function of men having a stronger interest, increasing the relevance of personal choice in the setting might increase the extent to which men are interested in STEM, but we didn't see that. Instead, what we saw is that men responded not to the sort of self-expression motive, but to the security motive, which I think speaks to what a kind of relational motivation, which is not exactly the sort of achievement motivation you might imagine is driving, if you're thinking about the kind of tech world and what's driving men's choices, you might imagine it's a sort of achievement motivation, but it suggests it might be a more relational motivation, in that motivated to achieve the kind of things they need to do to have a good life in their mind, which involves making money or having a secure existence. Going back, there was a bit of the model, if you've been following along in the paper, that I left off, and that's this bottom bit, and I think it relates to a lot of what people have been saying today, particularly Dr. Dasgupta, but also Dr. Cheryan, that an important part of the model is that people choose. They choose STEM or not. And then that constitutes gender gaps in STEM. And those gender gaps in STEM are not like the end of the process. A very important point of this perspective is to suggest that the realities we inhabit feed back into, create and reconstruct the psychological stuff that exists there in the first place. And I think that we all recognize this, but I think it has important implications for the way we think about the problem. In particular, it might lead us to consider the question of what is gender equality. And think back to some of these indices in the relationship. The Gender Equality Index is a measure of societal patterns and what representation in a bunch of different fields. But our evidence and some other evidence suggests that higher scores on the Gender Gap Index, meaning greater equality, are positively associated with the gender gap in STEM participation. And certainly positively, not only that, but also positively related to gender STEM associations and the implicit associations test of gender STEM associations. So those are two different measures we might be inclined to point to measures of gender equality. The one with the more societal indicators is not resonating with the other one that is using the more embodied psychological associations, and you might imagine, and those might not be related to the expressed gender beliefs of the person who is responding to the question. Which one of those is the real gender equality? Finally, the other provocation I want to share with you is this last point about liberty or liberation, which relates to what I just said. So I'm going to read it from the last part of the paper. So I hope you'll excuse me for that. So our review suggests that freedom from financial or relational maintenance concerns and freedom to pursue personal dreams may insidiously constrain women who seem otherwise liberated to conform to particular stereotypes about gender and academic pursuit. The point of this analysis is neither to blame women who inhabit settings of privilege for opting out of STEM, nor to imply that the gender gap is a frivolous first world problem that doesn't deserve attention. Instead, the point concerns the appropriate responses to gender oppression in STEM and otherwise. An understanding of liberation at the individual level, defined as liberty to enact personal goals and desires free of societal constraints, may resonate with people in weird and other societies that value self-expression. Drawing on this conception of liberation, conventional responses to the gender gap in STEM emphasize removal of gendered barriers to increase women's freedom of academic and professional choice. Although these efforts are worthwhile, here's where I have to switch. Cultural psychology approaches to the gender gap in STEM suggest that they may not automatically produce women's liberation in the sense of collective relief from structural inequality. From this perspective, the key to liberation from oppression may not lie in the expansion of individual liberty to pursue self-expression and personal fulfillment. Instead, individual liberation in this sense, as opposed to this idea of relief from structural inequality, may inadvertently contribute to societal gender stratification. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I'm see if I can you hear me here? Or here? This is better, right? Okay, let me do this then. All right, thank you so much. I know I'm the last thing standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to go quickly. I, like Glenn, want to say that I'm here kind of as an avatar for Kate Block, who was supposed to be here to give this talk, and so I'm really giving this on behalf of her. She and Maria Olsen really are the ones who have spearheaded this work, although I've tried to add my kind of conceptual bit. But I want to pick up on some of the themes that were raised in the first talk by Dr. Hashimoto and in the second talk by Dr. Adams, and talk about this paradox of gender progress. Because as we all know, the story of gender equality over the last century really is one of both progress and stagnation. And so to borrow terms from sociologists, we see evidence of decreased vertical segregation as women have been able to enter into the workforce increasingly across the globe, and especially in industrialized countries. And women have even been able to move into more leadership positions, although again, there's still a lot of work to be done there. Of course, here we've been focusing on persistent patterns of horizontal segregation, and today we've been focusing primarily on the underrepresentation of women in STEM fields, particularly like engineering and computer science. But I have to say, over the last decade, really, of thinking a lot about this type of underrepresentation, it's naturally kind of led us to also be curious about this parallel underrepresentation that gets much less attention, which is the severe underrepresentation of men in the care economy, fields associated with nursing, education, social welfare. And so I'm going to kind of broaden our scope a little bit to talk about that type of gender underrepresentation as well. And really this work picks up with the kind of paradoxical patterns that Glenn was alluding to in his talk. Why is it the case that we see some types of gender gaps that are paradoxically larger in countries that are known for being more gender egalitarian, that score high on the gender gap index, for example? And so in the psychological literature in recent years, people have referred to a gender equality paradox to talk about this phenomenon, just to give you kind of an example. So for example, 20% or 28% of scientists in Germany are women, a country that's we think of as having more equal rights for women compared to a country like Kuwait, where actually 53% of scientists are women. And it's led some people, I think the model that Nur and Glenn have written about in the paper that he just reviewed have a different approach, but some of the other authors up here have suggested, is there something about gender equality per se that maybe facilitates self-expression motives, that leads women to make more gendered choices? And the model that we've been working on tries to be integrative, to bring in a bit of a broader perspective and knit this together with some of the same kind of cultural ideologies that Glenn referred to, as well as people's own personal values. But I want to start with the role of economic development per se, because we focus first as these patterns of broadening horizontal segregation are probably not about gender equality as the predictor. They're probably more about economic affordances as a first order factor. And this isn't a novel approach. This is just borrowing what we've learned from sociologists like Maria Charles and David Grusky, who say that gender segregation is actively generated by contemporary market forces. That once you have a country that becomes more economically developed, you have a move from sort of smaller scale family-run businesses to larger hierarchically based corporations that allow for a structure that needs positions of leadership, that allows for industrialization, that provide jobs for women to enter the workforce, for example. That's why you see the decrease in vertical segregation in more economically developed countries. But at the same time, those economic affordances also create opportunities that lead to gender segregation into these different roles. And particularly what we're interested in is how economic development means that you have a large social safety net that pours public money into healthcare, free education for all, social safety nets, and someone has to do those jobs, and ideally cheaply. and women are more likely to get attracted into them. And so that's why you see these kind of paradoxical lower segregation on the one hand paired with higher segregation on the other hand. Now, that's just reviewing what sociologists have already talked about. As social psychologists, we're interested in how does ideology and values sort of help to perpetuate and reinforce these kinds of patterns. And so on the lower end, I think, our gender egalitarian beliefs is one kind of ideology that helps to reinforce the decreasing vertical segregation that we see. And as women go into the workforce and go into positions of leadership, we also know that those changing roles lead to changing stereotypes. So for example, over the last 50 years in the United States, for example, there's no longer a stereotype that associates competence more with men than with women. At least explicitly, people say that men and women are equally competent and equally intelligent today. There's still a remaining dominant stereotype. Men are associated with dominance more than women, probably because they still hold higher positions of status. But what about the horizontal patterns up above? We've been interested in the degree to which horizontal segregation, especially in the care economy, might be a function of cultural individualism. We know that economic development leads countries to shift from more collectivist, harmony-oriented ideology toward a more individualistic, agency-oriented ideology. But there's also evidence to suggest that individualism leads to a feminization of communal and collectivist traits. So for example, in this research by Amy Cuddy and colleagues, they found that this is country-level data. So in more individualistic countries, so countries that score higher on individualism, traits like being considerate, helpful, and warm are more likely to be associated with women rather than men. Whereas in highly collectivistic countries, which are on the low end of the x-axis, there's no gender association with these traits. We also know from work by Jen Bosson and others that, and it was kind of referenced in an earlier talk, that across the globe, men are penalized for seeming weak. I think this was in Sapna's word clouds, right? Penalized for seeming weak and feminine. So you put these two things together, and what that means that is, as countries become more individualistic, to be kind and considerate and helpful becomes a more feminine attribute and something that men are likely to avoid. So this brings us to the work that we've done with another consortium called UCOM, Understanding Communal Orientation in Men. And again, in this massive data collection effort spearheaded by Kate and Maria, with 137 collaborators across almost 50 countries, we were able to collect data on career interest and values from nearly 20,000 undergraduate students. And we pre-registered kind of our key hypothesis is, do we see this paradox of progress in care economy interest? And we asked people to consider, regardless of what you actually are majoring in, regardless of what your degree program is, could you imagine yourself working in nursing, in teaching, in social work? And across the globe, across these 50 countries, we see that women generally are more able to imagine themselves working in these careers compared to their male peers. But what you see is that countries that score higher in economic development, this is indexed here by the Human Development Index, which is an index that is not just representing economic output, it also represents health outcomes and educational outcomes. In other words, these are countries that pour more resources into the care economy to provide these jobs. So there's a labor market demand there, but who's attracted to filling that demand? It's more likely to be women than men. And that's this kind of paradox we're seeing. For those of you who are interested in sort of the stats of this, this pattern is robust to a lot of statistical controls. It's robust to controlling for the Gender Equality Index, so it really is predicted by the Human Development Index, as well as to students' own salary estimates. So this isn't about how much money they think they would make from these careers, at least in this case, as well as other variables we can talk about later if you're interested. What about STEM interests? So we also asked them how interested you would be in careers like computer science and two different forms of engineering. And for STEM interest, we saw that in general, men reported more interest than did women. But this didn't vary cross-culturally as a function of economic development or gender equality for that matter. So we didn't see evidence of this gender equality paradox in our STEM interest. Now, if you're like one of our reviewers, you might have wondered, okay, but you're asking people what they might be interested in. These aren't people's actual jobs. We downloaded the data from the International Labor Organization and did a replication analysis based on actual occupational data. And again, we find evidence of this paradox of progress in care interest. So now the y-axis is the percentage of women working in healthcare, social work, and education. And you can see this, the percentage of women is higher in more economically developed countries. If we were going to see a parallel or a complementary pattern for the gender gap in STEM, we should see a negative slope when I show you STEM, and we don't see that. If anything, it's a non-significant but positive trend, which is more of the kind of intuitive idea that in more economically developed countries, you actually do see a greater percentage of women working in STEM careers. So I'll get back to why we think we maybe don't see a pattern, this paradoxical pattern for STEM. But let me first go back to this question of why do we see the paradoxical pattern for women in care? And again, I kind of presented this unwieldy model earlier. The data that we have in this study really help us answer the top part of this model in terms of horizontal segregation in the care economy. And what we see, I've already shown you this path, more economic development, this wider gender gap in care interest. But we also see that that same widening gap is predicted by cultural individualism. And in fact, economic development and individualism are explaining the same variability in this model. They're kind of telling us the same story because they're highly correlated. This widening gender gap, women's stronger interest in care economy careers, isn't predicted by gender equality per se. It's also not predicted by self-expression values, which is something that we pre-registered looking at because of the work that Noor and Glenn had done that he presented earlier. So we're really interested in whether cross-national variability in self-expression values would explain this pattern. It didn't. So it's something I hope we can discuss more. Now, we are also interested in students' own personal values and how values are the thing that propel us to go into the occupations we go into, right? Buju in her talk talked about how we want to find meaning in our careers. And so I can show you first just a little bit about across this cross-national sample what the gender differences in values look like. We see again a very strong gender gap in communal values. These are college-age women are much more likely than men to say they value being caring and considerate and compassionate. We see also that men are more likely to say that they value being assertive and dominant, but that's about half the effect size as we saw for communion. And we see no gender gap in competence. So both men and women equally value competence across this international sample. But we were interested in whether or not any of these gaps in values are, again, related to economic variability across this cross-national sample. And we only found that economic development, or individualism for that matter, predicted a gap in communal values. And so again, what we see is that in countries that are wealthier, higher in economic development, we see this larger gender gap in communal values, driven here a little bit more by men's tendency to be less likely to endorse these values for themselves in wealthier countries compared to women. Putting this then together with this picture, we see, again, individualism predicts this relationship as well, and we think this is part of what might explain this pattern of women being, from economic forces, afforded to going into care economy jobs, and again, cultural ideologies of individualism and communal values and the gaps of those, perhaps reinforcing those patterns over time. Again, for STEM interest, we don't see any of these things related, including the values of achievement or dominance. So unfortunately, I have less to say about what we can predict from STEM in these data than I do about care interest. So why don't we see this gender equality paradox in STEM? I want to kind of address a few possible reasons why this is. One thing to mention is that in previous literature that has reported evidence, I mean, much of it is reviewed in the paper that Nur and Glenn published. Much of the research that's been done on participation is about majors, degree majors, not on occupations per se. So it's one thing to be in a culture that tries to educate talented girls and boys to get the kind of educational background they need to go into engineering or computer science careers. It's another thing to let them work there eventually, so that might be part of it. Also, past evidence with STEM majors shows mixed patterns. As Glenn sort of nicely showed in those tables, their really comprehensive review shows that you don't always see this pattern in the literature. And there are also papers out there that argue that with more rigorous analyses, these effects might even be more artifactual. But the other thing that I want to show you before I finish up, just in putting together this talk, I was going on the UNESCO site, and if I had like live internet access, I would show you this website. But they have this really cool graphic that shows the gender gap of research scientists, and you can. This is a video actually that you can hit play on. It starts at 1996 and ends at 2018. So I'll just toggle back and forth between them. The grayish arc there in the rainbow would be parity. Okay, so, and the lines shooting out are different countries and different regions of the world, and where they were in sort of the percentage of when reaching gender parity in scientists. So this is what the story looked like in 1998. So you see, in the European Union and Latin America, you start to see some progress toward parity, less so in sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Asia. By 2018, there is considerable progress made, but again, plenty of countries, including the one we're in right now, that's not there yet. And of course, we had Dr. Hashimoto's talk at the beginning, looking at Japan as being on the low end even today. So it's interesting to sort of think about, what these national patterns look like. But another slide I want to show you before kind of wrapping up and drawing some conclusions really resonates with a point that Glenn made in his prior talk too, that we often take an androcentric view of sort of assuming that men's behavior doesn't need to be explained. And so really what we should be trying to understand is why aren't women choosing to go into STEM or engineering and so forth. These are data from UNESCO, and actually Alicia Hammond was originally supposed to be on this panel, and she's a co-author on this report. If you ask here, this is sort of data showing this, some evidence of this gender gap in STEM participation. You see engineering at the top and information technology at the bottom, and these are quartiles by economic development. So yeah, there is a wider gender gap in engineering here. In wealthier countries that's kind of consistent with what we think of this gender equality paradox. But look at where I'm shining the light. It's not so much driven by what women are doing. It's driven by what men are doing. It's driven by the fact that in the wealthier countries, men are much more likely to be in engineering compared to the proportion in lower income countries. And one of the things that I just think these kind of data remind us is that when it comes to thinking about gender, we all often look at where we usually shine the light, which is on women's behavior, what women are doing, what women are choosing. And we sometimes forget to shine the light more broadly on men's behavior and choices and constraints and how challenging those constraints can be themselves. So what I've shown you today from these data that Kate and Bria have helped to really spearhead is that we do find evidence of a paradox of gender progress and horizontal segregation, but we find that evidence in the care economy more than we do in STEM. We find that it's linked to economic indicators and not necessarily to gender equality indicators at the cross-national level. We find that it's linked to cultural ideologies of individualism and don't find evidence here that it's linked to self-expression, although that might be limited by the measure that's out there. And we find that it's linked more proximally to men's own undervaluing of communal traits and values for themselves, and maybe less so to women's choices. So thank you so much.
So we will have, if Glenn could, and Takako, if you could come up here, we will have a short question and answer session. I know everybody's hungry and we want to have lunch and we're a little bit behind, but I think it would be good for us to have so I will start with a few questions as they've come in. The first one that I will start with is Dr. Hashimoto. You talked about how mother's STEM background predicted women's majors better than father's background. Is this better than father's background? And if so, why might this be? Yeah, mother's background can be, you talked about mothers. Does fathers predict, and if mothers predicts better than fathers, kind of why?
The reason, the mothers, but actually the Japan, they're still raising children is mainly mother's task. And their mother's influence is very, very important for, especially for their daughters. So therefore, their mother's background is more important than the father's background. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, Glenn, let's see where I lost the question that I had here. I'll find it shortly. Okay. Gender essentialism advocates like to cite findings that career choices are more gender traditional in egalitarian societies such as Scandinavia. How would you best argue against a biological explanation for this? Yeah,
Technologically challenged, sorry. I think it's a very important question, and it's one that we received from reviewers, of course, and it's one we consider all the time. And I think we don't have any evidence that speaks one way to the other. What we're trying to suggest is that preferences themselves are not immune to social and historical constitution. In fact, that's what social psychologists are talking about. I think that if the evidence suggests that that there was all that we're saying is that certain circumstances make that more important. Wherever those preferences come from become more important in certain circumstances. And the place where we go is to say, okay, let's think about what imagination of the concept of liberation we have. If we think that liberation is just giving people more freedom to make choices, that might have counterintuitive effects. And to that critic, we would just say, well, there's no evidence necessarily that it's biologically based either. There is evidence maybe you come up with. There's also evidence that these are socialized, and the model itself talks about how living in one context versus another, that those associations can be more important. I suppose the other thing I would say is, again, to think that what constitutes preferences may not be the more ideational aspects of belief, but the more implicit, structural, ecologically embedded affordances for belief.
All right, for Toni, very interesting data on shifting the lens to men. What implications does this have for making change? I.e., a first response might be to kick the men out?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's as hard as it is to make change for women's entry into STEM, it's even harder to go the other direction because the barriers are so hard. And we for example, we have work showing that when you ask people about how much do you care about rectifying these gender imbalances, women in STEM, men in care economy, people are less interested in doing anything about the gender imbalance in the care economy because they assume that men just aren't interested. And this idea, I mean, this is something that I'm really fascinated about, and it kind of ties to the last question that Glenn just answered, that this idea of where do our interests come from and the sort of automatic assumption that they're just intrinsic to us as opposed to being shaped by masculine defaults, shaped by the kind of constraints and the situations, the sociocultural elements. So I think that's really a new frontier is, a decade ago we were talking a lot about gender differences and stereotypes about ability, and people like Sapna and Alison Masters' work have sort of shown that it's gender differences in interest are something that we really need to take seriously and understand.
Can I come in on that a little bit? So I would say, especially I was interested by the kick men out part, because I understood your presentation to be how can we bring men into more caring kinds of professions. And I think that's where I'd like to tie it back to some of the earlier presentations and talking about the question of what is the kind of system that we have. And one of the questions I didn't get to on the slide about implications, why do we value STEM in the first place? I mean, I think we value STEM. Yeah, maybe it produces things socially. I mean, societally, why do we value STEM? There's a certain set of abilities that produce things that are very important to us, but these other skills about caring are also important to us. Why don't we societally value them? So I think getting, evening out the societal valuation is gonna, through things like making it materially feasible, might be playing a large part in who participates and who doesn't. And people may participate not because it's expressive to them, but they feel like they gotta do it because that's the way they're gonna be able to get anything in the world that they're forced to inhabit as well.
All right, I'm going to try and combine two questions here for Dr. Hashimoto. Can you speak to any data about the historical context for the beliefs in China and why Japan may have lagged to the OECD, to other OECD countries, and what could organizations like IEEE do to change some of the culture, both regionally and on a more international scale?
Yeah, that is actually that is a problem. So the India and China and such countries, previously they are very traditional and they almost same situation as Japan. However, they changed quickly there for these 25, 50 years. So, and they are now they are now able to have the very powerful women, so especially in the STEM field. But Japan cannot change our culture, and and now gradually changing our situation. But unfortunately, we have aging society, and it also the reason why we cannot change. Not easy to change our society culture. So this is one reason why we could not behind such the countries, I think.
All right, I'll ask one more question, I think, to Glenn and one more to Toni, and then we'll get to lunch. We had the question to Glenn, how do you see the independent abstraction related to white supremacy culture?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is, I think it's inherently related. So that's why I like to refer to this idea of modern individualism. And in the work that I'm doing right now, I like to think of modern, and you can't think about it without thinking about colonial. Like they go together. The modern was constituted through the colonial, and that abstraction from context, a big aspect of it is freedom from constraint. People feel as if they're not constrained. They can freely float. Realities give us, who inhabit those worlds, that sensibility of freedom from constraint. I think we know from looking at the work of a lot of scholars that that sense of freedom from constraint, the ability for some to have that sense of freedom depends on the labor and wealth of others. Feminist scholars have made this point for a long time about who's able to do things because their domestic labor gets taken care of. And of course, we know how the country and to the south and even this country got built, whose labor built a lot of it. So I think that it's inherently tied to those worlds.
All right, and then we have a question for Toni. What could we do to inoculate against the rising individualism producing care gaps? Is there a way to interrupt the link?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm, it's a chicken and egg sort of. It's hard to know how to exactly change the ideology of a culture. Often it takes sort of broad historical, either historical events or concerted efforts to incentivize people to go into different roles, and then once those roles start to change, then people's belief systems about them. But I think, both what Dr. Hashimoto, what Dr. Adams said as well, that the understanding that the constraints are quite large, and it takes sort of collective action, and I think a real rethinking of what do we value as a society and how do we work together to change those systems.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel for a great set of presentations. Let's give them all a round of applause. And we can head off for lunch now and try to keep on track.